She's too fat for this room. The words came out loud enough for 12 people to hear. Park Sung-woo didn't even lower his voice. He was standing at the entrance of the Meridian Club's private dining floor, surrounded by men who ran half the legitimate money in Busan, and he was staring directly at the woman, walking toward them, a black American woman in a practical coat, carrying a veterinary bag with cracked leather at the corners, moving like someone who had decided a long time ago that other people's cruelty was not going to slow her down. A vet, someone else said. He actually married a woman who washes dog blood off her hands. Lena Mercer heard every syllable. She kept walking. She had come to sign divorce papers. She hadn't come to bleed. But what none of those men knew, what even her husband didn't know, was that she was 11 weeks pregnant. And she had already decided to disappear. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end, because this story is only just beginning. Drop your city or country in the comments. I genuinely want to see how far this reaches. Now, let's go back to where it all started. The rain over Busan that morning had no warning in it. No thunder. No darkening sky that gave you time to pull out an umbrella or change your plans. Just a cold curtain that settled over the city like a decision that had already been made, and by the time you realized you were wet, there was nothing left to do about it. Lena Mercer stood outside the CO Financial Group, building for exactly 11 seconds. She had developed this habit years ago, during her first year in Korea, when she was still trying to figure out how to survive in rooms where she was consistently the most unwanted person. You gave yourself a specific number. You counted to it. You breathed through it, and then you moved, because standing outside didn't change what was inside, and waiting never made a hard room easier. 11 seconds. Then she pushed through the glass doors. She had been inside this building 3 times before. She had never once felt like she belonged in it, which was fine. Belonging wasn't something she had ever especially needed from this particular address. What she needed today was a conference table, 2 sets of documents, and about 30 minutes of controlled breathing, and then she could leave this building, and everything it represented for the last time. The lobby smelled like what she had privately come to think of as old money air recirculated, slightly cool, with the particular stillness of a place where conversations were conducted very carefully and raised. Voices were considered a form of failure. There was marble, but it was the restrained kind, not showy. There was wood that had been polished, so many times it no longer looked like wood so much as an idea of wood. She took the elevator. 3 men from the senior staff stepped in behind her. She recognized 2 of them advisors who had attended formal dinners at the Heto Synod with expressions of carefully managed respect for their employer and barely bothered indifference toward his wife. The third she knew by name, but had never directly spoken to, Park Sung-woo, mid-50s, chief operations strategist, the kind of man who understood money as a language and considered anything that wasn't money to be a form of noise. She faced the doors, hit 14, watched the numbers climb. He brought her in person, Park said, in Korean. The casual, unguarded Korean of someone who had made an assumption about who in the elevator understood him. Just to sign. Sentimental, one of the others said. Guilty, the third said. There's a difference. Either way. Park adjusted his cufflink. 5 years. She should be grateful it was that long. A comfortable apartment, clothes she couldn't have managed on a veterinarian's salary. A veterinarian. The word came out of Park's mouth with the specific contempt reserved for things that are not illegal, but should be, in his opinion, embarrassing. Do you remember the harbor dinner? She spent 20 minutes talking to Councilman Woo's wife about heartworm prevention. The laughter was quiet, the kind men use when they think they're alone. And a black American at that. This from the second one. Lower voice, but not low enough. What was he thinking? It was not a question. Questions imply openness to the possibility of an answer. Lena's hand tightened on the strap of her medical bag. The bag was the kind of object that told a story if you knew how to read it. The leather had cracked at the corners and been restitched twice, once in Seoul, once by her own hand in a cheap apartment in her second year of marriage, when she couldn't locate a cobbler who worked on that style. She had bought it during her second year of veterinary school, with money from 3 months of weekend grocery shifts. It had been with her through 2 continents, 4 clinics, and every moment of her adult life that had actually mattered. These men would not understand that. These men understood cost. Cost was a number. Value was a different calculation entirely, and it required a kind of attention they had never learned to pay. The elevator stopped. She stepped out first. She walked the full length of the corridor without slowing, without looking back, without doing a single thing that would have told Park Sung-woo or either of the men beside him that one word had reached her. She walked like a woman, going somewhere she had every right to go, which was exactly what she was. But something had shifted in her chest during that elevator ride. Something that had been leaning, uncertain, toward grief, the particular grief of a marriage ending, of 5 years reducing themselves to a conference table, and flagged signature pages had made a quiet decision. A decision that didn't announce itself with emotion or drama. It simply settled into place, the way a bone sets after it's been properly aligned. She was not going to cry in this building. She was not going to give Park Sung-woo, or anyone else in this building, the satisfaction of a single visible crack. Kang Tae-jin was 40 years old and stood at the window of his northeast corner office with his back to the door when she entered. Lena had spent 5 years watching this man, which meant she had spent 5 years learning the specific grammar of his silences, his stillnesses, the way he positioned himself in a room. He stood at windows when he needed to compose himself. He stood at windows when a conversation was about to require something from him that he hadn't fully prepared for. He was standing at this one, with both hands behind his back and his weight evenly distributed in the way of a man who had decided on his posture as a form of statement. She set the medical bag down on the conference table. He turned at the sound. Lena. His voice was careful, neither warm nor cold. The voice he used when he had already moved through whatever he felt privately and had arrived at the position he intended to present. The paper, she said. He gestured toward the table. 2 sets, yellow tabs on the relevant pages. His attorney had prepared everything with the thoroughness that Kang Tae-jin applied to all administrative processes, which was the same thoroughness he had applied to every part of their marriage, meticulous, competent, and structurally missing the point. She picked up the pen. Her handwriting was steady. She had practiced being steady for long enough that it no longer required effort, which was either an accomplishment or a small loss, depending on how you chose to look at it. She signed where the yellow tabs indicated. She set the pen down. Tae-jin picked it up and signed his copies without hesitation. 5 years of marriage, gone between one breath and the next. "You'll be safer when you're no longer my wife," he said. She looked at him directly for the first time since entering the room. She had been careful not to before the signing. Looking at him required a kind of expenditure she couldn't afford until after the papers were done. "You've decided that, yes, without asking me." Something moved across his face. Small, controlled immediately. "The situation has changed. There are people who what, Tae-jin?" Her voice was even. It was not a question either. "Who might hurt me? Who might use me to get to you? Because it's been true for 4 of the 5 years we've been married. You didn't divorce me, then." He didn't answer, and that was the answer. Something had changed recently. Something specific. And he had run the calculation, the same cold architectural calculation he applied to everything, and the output of that calculation was that she needed to not be his wife anymore. He had not consulted her. It had not occurred to him to consult her. The decision had been about her life, and it had been made entirely without her, and he addressed it in the language of protection because he had confused protection with love for so long that the distinction had become invisible to him. She picked up her medical bag. Tae-jin exhaled. She had heard that sound before. The slow, deliberate release of breath that happened when a problem had been resolved. When a decision that had been troubling him was finally executed and behind him and no longer required his attention. To Lena, standing 3 feet away with her divorce papers and her cracked leather bag and her 11-week secret, it sounded like relief. She had made her own calculation in the elevator on the way up. She finished making it now. "Take care of yourself," she said. Because she was still, Even now, the kind of person who said things like that. She walked out. She did not look back. The motel was 40 minutes from the building by bus. It was in a part of Busan that had no particular reason to know or care who Kang Tae-jin was, a practical, slightly worn section of the city, where the buildings were mostly functional and the streets were mostly honest, and nobody was performing anything for anyone. The room had a water stain on the ceiling shaped vaguely like a boot, and a window that faced a parking structure. The television received 6 channels, 3 of which were shopping programs selling items she could not imagine anyone needing. She sat on the edge of the bed and held the ultrasound photograph. It was small, grainy, the kind of image that required explanation before it resolved into anything recognizable, a particular smear of light and shadow that meant nothing unless you had been staring at it for 3 weeks, which she had. She could read it now without assistance. She knew exactly what she was looking at. 11 weeks. She had found out the week before Tae-jin told her he wanted a divorce. She had been trying to find the right moment to tell him. She had been running the conversation in her head, late at night when he was still at the office, imagining his face, the controlled face she had learned to read, the specific way certain things made it shift into something less managed. Something that happened only when he had decided she was the only one watching. She had been rehearsing for a completely different story. Now she sat in a motel room that smelled like industrial cleaning products and somebody else's cigarettes, and she understood that the story had changed while she wasn't paying attention to anything except the story she thought she was in. She made herself think, not feel she could feel later. She promised herself that she had gotten good at scheduled emotion, the way some people got good at scheduled exercise, something you put away until you had the bandwidth for it. But think. A divorced wife could still be used against him. His enemies would not honor a legal document. The divorce might remove her from his formal protection, but it would not remove her from their calculations. Not once they knew she had been close to him for 5 years. Not once they discovered the child, his child. A child would not be a loose end. A child would be a leverage point, a threat, a negotiating tool in the hands of people who had no problem using either. Lena turned the ultrasound photograph over and looked at it from the other side, as if the blank paper there might show her something the image itself didn't. She thought about Park Sung-woo in the elevator. She thought about the sound of Tae-jin exhaling. She thought about the 4 years she had spent learning to read rooms, learning to identify exits, learning to recognize the specific quality of silence that preceded danger, learning all of the things she had learned, not from any training, but from the simple ongoing act of paying careful attention to the world the man she had married moved through. She put the photograph flat against the bedspread. She looked at it one more time. Then she picked up her phone and called the only person she trusted. Ryu Song-ho answered on the second ring. This was unusual. Seong-ho was a man who generally made you wait for 4 rings as a matter of cultivated principle, some old habit from decades of operating in environments where eagerness communicated weakness. 2 rings meant he had been expecting her call. 2 rings meant he had been sitting somewhere with the phone in his hand, waiting. "Where are you?" he said. Not a greeting. He didn't ask those either. A motel. Doesn't matter where. She kept her voice low even though the parking structure outside was empty and the walls were thin, and she was speaking to the only person she was going to speak to tonight. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the actual truth." "I always tell you. You tell me what you think I can handle," she said. "That's different. You've been doing it for 3 years. And I've been letting you because sometimes I needed that, and sometimes I needed to not see the whole picture." A pause. "Tonight I need the picture." Song-ho was quiet. Not the quiet of a man who didn't know. The quiet of a man deciding how far to open the door. "Something changed," she said. "Recently. Something specific. Something that made him decide the divorce had to happen now. This month. Not 6 months from now or next year." "What was it?" The silence lasted long enough that she started counting it. Then Song-ho said Jong Murion. She knew the name. She knew it, the way the wives of powerful men knew certain names not from direct conversation, but from the peripheral accumulation of information that came from being present in rooms where important things were discussed and being underestimated as a listener. "He's been watching you." Song-ho said. Not Tae-jin. You. For approximately 4 months. Tae-jin found out 6 weeks ago and decided a divorce would protect me. He believed that removing the formal connections would reduce my value as a target. She said it flat. The voice she used when something was true and being true didn't make it any less insulting. He thought a piece of paper would protect me. That was his reasoning. Yes. And you, she said. What did you think? A pause. Shorter than the first. I thought he was wrong, Song-ho said. But Kang Tae-jin does not often ask my opinion on matters he has already decided. She looked at the ultrasound photograph on the bedspread. I need help, she said. The kind that means you don't tell him. This silence was the longest one. She counted 17 seconds before he spoke. Lena, he made a decision about my life without consulting me, she said. I'm making one about mine. I need documents. Money that can't be traced. Routes. She let that sit for a moment. And I need you to understand that if you tell him before I'm gone, I will never forgive you. And I think you know that matters to me. She heard him breathe. She waited. How far, he said. Far enough that Murion stops being able to find me. That's not a distance, Song-ho said. That's a principle. Then help me make it a distance. They met the next morning at a restaurant Song-ho had been using for 20 years. The owner had every reason to be discreet, and no additional motivation to be otherwise, which was the only kind of establishment Song-ho used for conversations that mattered. It was small, slightly too warm, and served a soup that Lena had eaten in this room twice before, on occasions that had nothing to do with what was happening today. Song-ho looked older than he had 2 weeks ago at the formal dinner. This was strange, because 2 weeks was not enough time for a person to actually age. But grief and loyalty existed in that man's face. In layers you could see them or not see them, depending on what the light was doing and what he had been carrying lately, and today, all of them were visible at once. He put an envelope on the table. Inside, a passport. 2 additional identity documents, a prepaid phone with a SIM card, and nothing else on it, no contacts, no history, just a clean number that could be changed and would be. And more cash than she had expected, in denominations that would not attract attention at borders. Jennifer Park, he said. Korean mother, American father. The documents are good, not perfect. Nothing is perfect but good enough for where you'll need to go. She looked at the passport photograph. Her own face. A different name underneath it. The specific strangeness of being legally someone else, held in the palm of your hand. Japan first, Song-ho said, then you decide. Don't stay anywhere more than 6 weeks in the beginning. Don't contact anyone from your current life. Change your appearance, not dramatically. Just enough to not match the photograph in Murion's files. You've thought about this. I've been thinking about it, he said carefully, since Tae-jin told me what he was planning to do. She looked at him across the table. You knew he was wrong from the beginning. Yes, but you didn't stop him. You cannot stop Kang Tae-jin from a decision he has made. His voice was not apologetic. It was honest, which was Song-ho's version of apology. What I could do was prepare for the consequences. She reached into her coat pocket. She placed the ultrasound photograph on the table between them. Song-so looked at it. He did not speak for a long time. His face did not change in any dramatic way. He had spent 30 years in a world where visible reaction was a liability, and the training was deep. But something behind his eyes changed. Something that had been operating at one temperature shifted to another. 11 weeks, she said. He doesn't know. You were going to tell him. Before he handed me the papers, she picked the photograph back up. Yes, I was rehearsing the conversation. She looked at it. I'm not telling anyone now. Except you. I need someone to know. She held it across the table toward him. Keep it. And someday, not now, not for a long time, let him find it. Song-ho took the photograph from her hand. He looked at it one more time. Then he folded it with the care of someone handling something that could not be replaced and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. Not yet, he said. Not yet, she agreed. They sat for another 20 minutes. Song-ho told her everything she needed to know about moving through the world without leaving traces, how surveillance operations worked. what patterns they looked for, which systems were trackable, and which had gaps. He spoke like a man who had spent his entire adult life in a particular kind of world and had quietly always been keeping track of the exits. When she stood to leave, he didn't hug her. That was not something Seong-ho did. But he looked at her for a moment in a way that communicated more than most people managed, with full embraces. "Be harder than you think you are," he said. "I've been practicing," she told him. She walked out into the Busan morning. 3 days later, Lena Mercer, carrying a battered leather medical bag, a prepaid phone, a passport that said Jennifer Park, and a secret that was 11 weeks and 4 days old, boarded a ferry leaving Busan harbor. She did not look back at the city. She had memorized what it looked like. She didn't need to see it again. Not yet. Japan was cold in the way of cold that didn't negotiate. She found a clinic outside Osaka, small, understaffed, run by a woman in her 60s named Dr. Tanaka, who asked very few questions and paid in cash on Fridays, and seemed to have made a private decision decades ago that the medical needs of animals were more important than the complete documentation of the people treating them. Lena was careful not to be exceptional, competent and reliable and present, but not the kind of person who invited conversation or created the specific kind of impression that made her memorable in ways she couldn't control. She showed up. She did the work. She went home to the small apartment that cost less than she'd spent monthly on dry cleaning during the marriage. She cut her hair 2 weeks after arriving, not dramatically. Shorter, without the careful shaping that had been part of her presentation for 5 years. It looked like a woman who had stopped having time for maintenance, which was exactly what she had become. She moved every 6 weeks, Osaka to Kyoto. Kyoto to a smaller city she had chosen specifically because she had never heard of it before, which meant it was unlikely to appear in any of her identifiable patterns. Then the pregnancy began to show. She sat in the parking lot after her first prenatal appointment as Jennifer Park and allowed herself 5 minutes of the things she had been compressing since the Busan motel room. Not grief anymore. Grief had been the first layer, and she had moved through it in the nights on the ferry and the first weeks in Osaka. What was underneath grief was more complex. Something that had been grief when she started and had slowly, under the sustained pressure of motion and necessity and the specific discipline of survival, compressed itself into something denser, harder to name, considerably harder to break. She called Song-ho from the prepaid phone. "I'm fine," she said before he could ask. "I know you are," he said. A pause. "He's looking. Already? The day after you left." She had expected this. What she hadn't expected was the specific feeling it produced in her not satisfaction. Exactly. Not fear. Something caught between them. Something she didn't have a clean word for yet. He was looking for her. Tae-jin, who had signed those papers and exhaled, who had made a unilateral decision about her life, without once asking what she wanted, who had spent 5 years treating their marriage like a logistical problem he was responsible for managing. That man was now apparently burning significant resources, trying to find the woman he had just legally discarded. "Good," she said. She wasn't entirely sure what she meant by it. But she meant something. She found the dog in China, 3 months after leaving Japan. She had taken a position at an understaffed clinic in a mid-sized city, the kind of place that needed hands and prioritized competence over paperwork, and she had been there 2 weeks when she first noticed the animal outside. He was large, mixed-breed, reddish-brown fur going gray at the muzzle. He had the patient, permanent posture of an animal that had been waiting for something for a long time and had stopped, fully expecting it to arrive, but had not yet made the decision to leave. Every morning when she arrived, he was at the entrance. Every evening when she locked up, he was still there. She asked around. Nobody knew him. The staff assumed he had adopted the clinic as territory, the way animals sometimes did, and they fed him intermittently and otherwise left him to his business. One afternoon, Lena sat beside him on the clinic steps. She looked at his face. There was something in his expression that she recognized. The specific dignity of a creature that had been abandoned and had decided not to make a scene about it. Not to whine, not to demand, just to maintain what it could of its routine in the place it had chosen and wait. She recognized it because she had been doing the same thing. "You're coming with me," she said. He looked at her. "I know we're moving again soon," she said. "That's fine. You'll get used to it." He seemed to consider this with the seriousness it deserved. Then he moved closer to her on the step. She named him Copper. Because of the color, and because she had always liked the idea of something that could conduct heat, age into a different kind of beauty, hold together under sustained pressure. He was old. He was arthritic. He was absolutely terrible to travel with, and not even slightly house. And he snored at a volume that was genuinely impressive for an animal his size. She loved him immediately and completely, which surprised her less than it should have. The loneliest part was the pregnancy. She could not talk about it with anyone. She could not call her mother back in Georgia, not because her mother would have betrayed her, but because involving her mother would have placed her mother directly in Tae-jin's path when he came asking, and he would come asking, and her mother would have told him the truth, because her mother had never successfully lied to anyone in her life, and had no particular interest in starting. She could not call her college friends, her former colleagues from the Soul Clinic, anyone from the life that was now behind the line she had crossed. She had Seong-ho, monthly calls, never more than 4 minutes. From phones she bought new each time. And she had Copper, who slept against her legs as her stomach grew, and who seemed to understand, in the specific way of dogs that have survived abandonment, that his primary responsibility was simply to remain. The baby was born on a Tuesday afternoon. A hospital in Central Europe, in a country Lena had chosen, specifically because its border controls were careful and its hospital system was functional, and nobody there had any particular interest in Korean criminal politics. She had prepared for the birth the way she had prepared for everything, in the preceding months, methodically, without sentiment, accounting for every complication she could anticipate. She had a plan for the paperwork, a plan for the first weeks, a plan for what came next. What she hadn't planned for was the sound. The first cry, furious, insistent, an absolute announcement of existence, broke something open in her that 5 years of marriage and 6 months of running had not been able to touch. She held the baby against her chest and looked at her face. Dark skin, her skin, and her father's eyes not yet the storm gray they would become, but already carrying something structural that Lena recognized instantly. A particular shape to the lid, the spacing, Tae-jin's eyes in her daughter's face. She held her and breathed. Then she cried until there was nothing left. Then she wiped her face on the hospital sheet and looked at Copper, who was technically not authorized to be in the room and had arrived there through Lena's firm and entirely calm assertion that she was a veterinarian and the animal was medically necessary and she was happy to discuss it further with anyone who wanted to have that conversation. "Her name is Mashra," she told him. Copper put his chin on the edge of the bed and exhaled. It sounded exactly like acceptance. Song-ho left the ultrasound photograph where Tae-jin would find it. On a gray Thursday morning, 14 months after Lena disappeared from Busan Harbor, he slid it into a folder of documents that Tae-jin would review before a morning briefing. Nothing dramatic about the placement, no note attached, no explanation. Just the photograph, in its original condition, slightly worn at the edges from 14 months, inside Song-ho's jacket pocket, with Lena's handwriting on the back in small, precise letters, 11 weeks. J. K. Just kidding. She had written it and then crossed it out with a single clean line, and the crossing out said more than the words themselves. Just kidding was what you said when you wanted to take something back. She hadn't wanted to take it back. She had wanted him to understand exactly what it felt like when it landed. Tae-jin found it at 7:43 in the morning. Song-ho was standing in the doorway, not inside the office, not positioned as a participant in whatever was about to happen, but close enough to witness it because he had decided that witnessing it was the least he owed both of them. He watched Tae-jin pull the photograph from the folder. He watched the moment Tae-jin understood what he was holding. It was a small moment, externally a slight stillness, a fractional shift in how the man held his shoulders. But Seong-ho had spent 30 years reading Kang Tae-jin's body language with the precision of someone whose professional survival had occasionally depended on it. And what he saw in that small moment was a man whose internal architecture had just taken a hit it hadn't been built to absorb. Tae-jin looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked up. "How long have you had this?" he said. Song-ho didn't answer. Tae-jin looked back at the photograph. His voice, when it came again, was slower than usual. The deliberate slowness of someone working through something in real time while trying to maintain the appearance of not working through something. She was pregnant, yes. When she came to sign. Yes. The silence that followed was unlike any silence Song-ho had witnessed from this man in 30 years. Tae-jin's silences were usually tactical, the kind that communicated controlled consideration. That said, I am deciding how to respond rather than I do not know how to respond. This silence had no strategy in it. It was simply the sound of a man standing inside a fact that had no comfortable angle. "She's been running," Tae-jin said. Not a question. Processing. The way he processed things he had not anticipated out loud, sequentially, as if speaking the steps helped him verify them. This whole time, not just from Murion, she's been running with. He stopped. Set the photograph on the desk. "My child." "Yes." Tae-jin stood very still for a moment. Then something happened to Kang Tae-jin that Seon had not seen in 30 years of standing in proximity to this man. He sat down heavily in his chair. He put his elbows on the desk. He pressed his face into his hands. It lasted 8 seconds. When he looked up, the control was back. But it was different control, the same structure, different contents. The way a container looks the same from the outside regardless of what's been poured into it. "Find her," he said. He didn't say please. He had never been fluent in please. But Sung-ho heard it underneath the sentence, in the specific quality of the request, not the commanding register he used for operational directives, but something rawer and less certain. "I'll try," Sung-ho said. He knew, even then, that trying was going to be the most complicated thing he'd done in 3 decades. The search consumed Tae-jin in a way that his organization had not seen from him before. He deployed resources that most governments would have found impressive operatives in 12 countries, private intelligence contractors who worked without asking questions about the purpose of their work, financial infrastructure sufficient to sustain the operation indefinitely. He activated networks he had not touched in years, called in relationships he had been carefully preserving for circumstances. Exactly this significant. Every lead dissolved, every sighting resolved into a different woman, or a trail that ended at a border crossing with no record on the other side. Every contact came back with some variation of the same answer. She had been here, and then she had not been here, and nobody could identify the exact moment of the transition. This was not the behavior of a frightened woman running in a straight line. 3 weeks after the photograph, Tae-jin stood at his office window and told Seong-ho what he had concluded. "She's been trained," he said. "By whom?" Tae-jin turned from the window. His expression had the specific quality of a man confronting something he found professionally humiliating. "By me. By watching me. 5 years of watching how I operate, how surveillance works, what patterns are trackable. She knows which systems have gaps. She knows how to change her routine before it becomes predictable." He looked at Seong-ho directly. "I built the environment she learned to escape from." Song-ho had an expression he used for moments when he agreed completely with something that gave him no satisfaction whatsoever. He used it now. "Then approach it differently," Seong-ho said. "Don't look for where she is. Look for what she needs." What she needs. She's a veterinarian. She has a child. She has to work. She can't live entirely on what Song-ho stopped. Tae-jin went still. The pause had been a fraction of a second too long. Song-ho heard it himself as it happened and understood that it was already too late to correct for it. "On what you gave her," Tae-jin said. Song-ho kept his face steady. "You helped her," Tae-jin said. "Yes." The silence between them was not comfortable. It was not meant to be. Song-ho had known this conversation was coming from the moment he placed the photograph in that folder. He had decided he would face it without apology, because apologizing would imply he believed he had done something wrong, and he did not believe that. "You helped her run from me," Tae-jin said. I helped her run from the consequences of your decision, Seong-ho said. His voice did not rise. It carried the particular measured weight of a man who had thought about every word before using it. There's a difference. Tae-jin's jaw tightened. You should have told me she was pregnant. She asked me not to. You work for me. I have worked for you, Song-ho said, for 30 years. In those 30 years, I have never once done something that was genuinely against your interests. Helping her was not against your interests. It was the only available action that protected your child from Murion's network while you were still under the impression that a divorce would solve everything. Tae-jin stared at him. Seong-ho stared back. This was one of perhaps 6 conversations in 30 years that had required both of them to decide, before the next sentence, how important the relationship was. She would have been taken, Seong-ho said, if she had stayed. If she had been visibly pregnant and newly divorced, and therefore outside your formal protection. Mujian was already watching her. You know that. You knew it when you filed the papers. He let that sit for one breath. What you didn't account for was what a pregnant woman with no protection and no warning becomes in that context. I accounted for it. Tae-jin turned back to the window. Outside, Busan was doing its ordinary morning business. Trucks on the coastal road, containers through the port. The city had no interest in his problems, which was one of the things he had always respected about it. Where did you send her? He said. I gave her routes. Not destinations. I told her how to move, not where to go. I don't know where she is now, but you've been in contact. Occasionally, she calls. Short calls. She tells me she's fine. She doesn't tell me where she is, and I don't push. Song-ho paused. That was the arrangement. Tae-jin pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. It was a gesture Seong-ho had seen twice before, in 3 decades, both times in the years before the empire had compressed Tae-jin into something that didn't allow visible stress. It meant he was at the edge of what his composure could hold without assistance. Find me something, Tae-jin said finally. Veterinary licensing activity. Hospital records if there's a child registered somewhere. School enrollment when the child is old enough. Don't look for Lena. Look for a woman who behaves like her. Sung-ho nodded and left without either of them saying anything more. There was nothing more to say yet, and because Sung-ho understood that the most important part of 30 years of loyalty was knowing when to simply leave the room. Han So-yeon had worked for Kang Tae-jin for 9 years. In those 9 years, she had built herself into something indispensable through a combination of genuine financial intelligence and the specific patience of a person who had decided very early on that the distance between her current position and her intended one was purely a matter of time and the correct application of leverage. She was 36. She dressed with the precision of someone who understood that appearance communicated authority before a single word was spoken. She had an MBA from a program that Tae-jin's people had initially dismissed until the quality of her work made the dismissal embarrassing enough that nobody referenced it anymore, which suited her fine. She had also been feeding information to Jang Moo-ryeon for approximately 3 years. Not out of ideology, not out of personal hatred, though she had reasons for that too, reasons that lived in a specific period of her professional history that she did not discuss with anyone. She operated from calculation, the same cold structural calculation that everything else in her life proceeded from. It was clean, it was rational. It made complete sense if you followed the logic without letting emotion contaminate the variables. Tae-jin was distracted. A distracted man needed competent people around him to hold the architecture together. So Cheon was the most competent person he had. His distraction was her opportunity. Not to take anything from him, not yet, not directly, but to position herself as so essential to the organization's functioning that when the distraction eventually resolved itself, she would be embedded in a way that couldn't be reversed. The arrangement with Muryeon was elegant. So-yeon received advance notice whenever Muryeon planned to move against the organization's legitimate business interests, which allowed her to protect those interests and demonstrate her value to Tae-jin. In return, whenever Tae-jin's search came close to producing a real result, So-yeon informed Muryeon, who ensured the result evaporated before it could be confirmed. Everyone got something. The one variable she had miscalculated was Seong Ho. She had always been careful around Song Ho. He had never liked her, not with any visible hostility, but with the specific, polite precision of someone who had read her accurately and decided that accuracy was sufficient reason to maintain distance. She had learned to conduct herself around him the way you conducted yourself, around a camera you couldn't turn off, always aware of the angle, always presenting only what you intended. For 3 years, the performance had been adequate. Then on a Tuesday afternoon in the 4th year, Song Ho called her into his office. He was standing at his desk when she entered. He had a folder in his hand. He did not offer her a chair. "You authorized the payment to Kessler Consulting last March," he said. Kessler, a private intelligence contractor. She had used them for a specific purpose that she had categorized in Tae-jin's records as due diligence on a European banking partnership. "Correct," she said. The work order referenced Central European surveillance operations. Due diligence often requires the target in the work order, Song Ho said, and he set the folder on the desk between them with the specific care of someone placing evidence rather than paper, was a woman named Jennifer Park. He looked at her. "That name does not appear in any of our banking partners' documentation." So Yan looked at the folder. She kept her breathing even. This was something. She was very good at keeping her breathing, even while her brain ran very fast in the opposite direction of what her face was showing. "I must have don't," Song Ho said, one word. "Quiet." Absolute. The word of a man who had been patient for a very long time and had reached the end of what patience was going to accomplish. So Yan closed her mouth. Song Ho looked at her with an expression she had never seen from him before in 4 years of working in proximity to him. It was the expression of a man who had finished waiting. "The work order is dated 11 days after Tae-jin received intelligence, placing Lena in the Prague area," he said. 11 days. Not sufficient time to complete due diligence on any banking partner. Sufficient time to commission surveillance on a specific individual and transmit the results to someone who benefits from that individual not being found. He held her gaze without effort, the way people who are telling the truth hold gazes. How long? So-yeon ran the calculation. She was fast. She had always been fast. What she calculated in the 3 seconds before she answered was that denial had a cost. The folder on the desk represented documentation she hadn't known existed, which meant Song Ho had been working toward this conversation for longer than she had been aware of, which meant the documentation was likely more comprehensive than what was visible, and that Song Ho had not brought this to Tae-jin first, which meant he was giving her a window she didn't deserve and didn't fully understand yet. 3 years, she said. The silence was extraordinary. Not long, but extraordinary in its quality, the silence of a room in which something that had been invisible for 3 years had just become visible all at once. 3 years, Song Ho repeated. His voice had not changed register. It was somehow worse for not changing. Every time he was close. The arrangement was mutually protective. Murion agreed not to move against our core legitimate operations in exchange for you telling him whenever Tae-jin was close to finding his child. Song Ho's voice was still even. Still quiet. 3 years. You kept a man from finding his daughter for 3 years. I protected the organization's financial. You protected your position, he said. You identified a distracted man, and you decided that his distraction was more valuable to you than his clarity. And you maintained that distraction deliberately for 3 years by ensuring that every time he came close to what he was looking for, it disappeared. He picked up the folder. This is not strategy. This is not protecting the organization. This is an architecture for replacing him. So Yan said nothing. There was nothing to say that would help. I haven't told him yet, Song Ho said. She looked up. I'm telling you that because what happens next depends on whether you understand what you actually done. He put the folder under his arm. You kept a child away from her father for 3 years. Whatever your calculation was about Tae-jin and your position, you kept a child away from her father. Do you understand what he will do when he knows that? So Yinsin understood. She understood it with the specific crystalline clarity of someone who had spent 4 years studying Kang Tae-jin at close range, and knew exactly what he was capable of when the damage was personal rather than operational. "What do you want from me?" she said. "I don't want anything from you," Song-ho said. "I'm going to tell him tonight. I'm informing you first because you need to decide what to do with the hours between now and then." He walked to the door. She heard her own voice do something she hadn't authorized, a slight thinning, a fraction of the pressure underneath it becoming audible. "You have no verified proof that I passed specific intelligence to Mu Rion directly. The work order alone is." "I have more than the work order," Song-ho said. "I have been watching you for 14 months. He opened the door. "The proof is sufficient." He left. So Yeon stood in his office for 30 seconds after the door closed. Then she walked back to her own office, sat at her desk, and began making phone calls. Not to Mu Rayon. That conversation would come later. First, the people she had spent 3 years quietly positioning. People who owed her things, professional things, financial things, the accumulated currency of favors done, and problems solved, and credit quietly deflected to the right places. She needed to know how solid those relationships were. She needed to know who would hold and who would calculate their own survival the moment the situation became clear. She had hours, so Yeon had always known what to do with hours. Song-ho told Tae-jin that evening. He laid it out the way he laid out everything, without editorial, without visible emotion, with the precision of a man delivering a structural assessment of a building that had been compromised at its foundation, without anyone noticing the cracks. He showed him the folder, the work orders, the communication records he had spent 14 months assembling, the financial transfers, the timeline mapped against every significant moment in the search when a confirmed lead had gone cold within days of becoming confirmed. He showed Tae-jin how many times he had almost found them. He showed him how many times So-yeon had made sure that finding didn't happen. Tae-jin sat through the entire 40 minutes without speaking. His face did something during those 40 minutes that Seong-ho had seen only twice before. In 30 years, it became genuinely still. Not the practiced stillness of a man managing his expression for an audience. The other kind. The stillness that happened when something landed in a place so deep that the surface had nothing left to contribute. When Song-ho finished, Tae-jin asked one question. "Is Lena currently in danger?" "Yes," Seong-ho said. Mu Rion has independent surveillance on Prague. Whatever So-yeon has passed him, he has been running his own search. He is close, possibly days. Tae-jin stood up from his desk. "Then I need to be in Prague," he said. "There's something else," Seong-ho said. Tae-jin looked at him. "Lena called me this morning." Seong-ho chose his next words with the care of a man who understood that how something was said was sometimes as consequential as what was said. "She's seen surveillance outside her clinic. She knows someone has found her. She doesn't know yet whether it's you or Murion." "It's both," Tae-jin said. "Yes. She'll run. She's been running for 5 years, Song-ho said. "She knows how." Tae-jin was already moving. He stopped at the door and put one hand flat against the frame. One of those moments where the physical object became necessary, where you needed something solid to press against, while something large moved through you that you weren't going to show anyone. It lasted 3 seconds. Then he turned. "Call her," he said. "Tell her to stay exactly where she is. Tell her I'm coming." A pause. Shorter than the first. "Tell her she has my word." "She may not accept that," Song-ho said. "I know," Tae-jin said. He left. Song-ho sat alone in the office for a moment. Then he picked up his phone. Lena was midway through suturing a cut on a gray cat when the call came. The owner, a woman in her 50s, who had wrapped the cat in a kitchen towel before bringing it in and was crying with the specific quality of someone who was using the cat as permission to cry about something else, entirely was standing at the treatment table, making small apologetic sounds that Lena was navigating around with the practiced ease of 6 years in practice. She saw Song-ho's number. The cold that moved through her was specific and immediate. She knew the difference between his scheduled calls and his unscheduled ones, and she knew what the unscheduled ones meant. "1 second, she told the woman. She stepped into the back hallway and answered. "Tell me," she said, not hello. She had stopped doing hello on these calls years ago. 2 surveillance teams outside your clinic, Shang-ho said. Not 1. 2. She had seen 1. The car at the corner, the rotation pattern she'd identified 2 days ago, the specific way it was positioned to cover both the main entrance and the side street. She had already begun the preliminary steps of preparing to move. Who is the second? Kessler Consulting. A private intelligence contractor. He paused, and she heard something being decided in the pause. A door opening that had been closed. Commissioned by someone inside Tae-jin's organization. The hallway was cold. The building's heating had a long-running argument with the radiators on this side that had never been resolved. Someone inside his organization, she said, slowly, has been helping Mu Rion find me. Yes, she closed her eyes. Open them. How long? 3 years. 3 years. She stood in the hallway and let that land. 3 years. She thought about the time she had moved in the last 3 years. The 2 occasions when she had moved slightly earlier than she'd planned, driven by something she had attributed to instinct. The feeling of pressure without a visible source. She had thought she was getting better at reading environments. She had thought her instincts had sharpened from sustained practice. It had been a deliberate hand, inside Tae-jin's own operation, touching every lead he had gotten close to and making it disappear before it could confirm. He doesn't know, she said. He's been searching honestly. Every time he came close was engineered to fail, Song-ho said. Yes. Something moved through Lena that she did not have time to sit with, but that she registered a complicated thing, adjacent to several emotions, without being cleanly any of them. He's coming to Prague, Song-ho said. He wants you to stay where you are. That's not his decision. Lena's Mara safe right now, cutting through the rest of it. The only question that mattered at the operational level. At this moment, she's at your apartment. No surveillance on the apartment yet. Only on the clinic, but Murion's team will expand. How long do I have hours? Possibly less. Lena looked at the wall in front of her. A veterinary anatomy chart, slightly crooked, that had been there since before she started working at this clinic. She had straightened it twice. Both times it had gone crooked again. She had stopped straightening it. She thought about what 5 years had cost. She thought about what the next decision was going to cost. Tell him, she said, that I will not stay. I will move Mara tonight. If he is in Prague tomorrow, I will decide at that point whether I trust him enough to tell him where we are. Lena, Murion, I know what Murion is, she said. I've known what Murion is for 5 years. Her voice was not loud. Quiet carried better than loud in hallways. Tell Tae-jin that if he wants to find us, he needs to be faster this time. Tell him that's not an insult. It's a fact. She hung up. She went back into the treatment room and finished the suture. She told the cat's owner it would be fine. She charged her a reduced rate because the woman clearly had very little money, and the cat was the most important thing in her life. And Lena had always been bad at charging full price to people for whom full price was genuinely a sacrifice. She locked the clinic. She packed her bag with the movements of someone who had done this before, efficient, without ceremony, the particular choreography of a life that had learned to leave cleanly. She walked out into the Prague evening at exactly the pace of someone who had done nothing unusual today and was simply going home. She did not look at the car at the corner. She felt it watching her. She kept walking. Mara was awake when Lena came through the apartment door. She was 5 years old and should have been asleep by any reasonable standard. But Mara had never been especially interested in reasonable standards and had developed, somewhere around age 3, the ability to detect when her mother's energy had changed from a distance that suggested the skill might not be entirely learned. She was sitting on the living room floor, with a drawing she'd been working on precise. For a 5-year-old, the lines deliberate rather than exploratory. And she looked up with her father's eyes and said, "You have your fast face on with the matter-of-fact directness of a child who had spent her entire conscious life learning to read her mother's face as a primary source of information about the world." "I have my regular face," Lena said. "Your regular face and your fast face look the same, except regular doesn't have the thing around your eyes." Lena crouched down in front of her. "We're going to take a little trip tonight," she said. Mara looked at her steadily. How little? Vienna, probably. Is someone looking for us? Always, Lena said, because lying to Mara had never been a sustainable option, and she had stopped attempting it somewhere in year 2. Tonight it's closer than usual, so we're going somewhere safer while we figure it out. Mara looked at the drawing in her hands. Can I bring this? Yes. And Copper. Copper was already at the door. He had the expression of a dog who understood that the appearance of the packed bags meant was happening, and he had made an early decision to be part of it, regardless of his arthritis. Copper goes everywhere we go, Lena said. Mara rolled up the drawing carefully. Precise about her drawings. Always had been. She treated them with a seriousness that Lena found both admirable and quietly heartbreaking, the way children's serious things sometimes were. They were out of the apartment in 20 minutes. The night train to Vienna left at 11:40. They were on it, and in the seat across from them, a man in a coat that was slightly too large for his frame appeared to be sleeping. And Lena watched him for the first 40 minutes of the journey with the attention she had developed over 5 years of watching for things that didn't fit, and she eventually decided he was genuinely asleep and not a problem. But she didn't sleep herself. She sat with Mara's head against her shoulder and Copper's weight against her feet and the dark landscape moving past the glass, and she thought about 3 years of someone's inside Tae-jin's organization, pointing Mu-rion at her like a compass needle. 3 years of being found and not found, close calls she hadn't even recognized as close calls because the hand steering them away had been invisible. She thought about the fact that he had been searching honestly. She had spent 5 years constructing a specific understanding of that exhale in the Busan office, the sound of a man relieved to be free of a complication, a problem resolved, a loose end tied off. She had used that understanding as the fuel for everything. The discipline of the false names, the 6-week moves. The 3 in the morning when Mara was sick and Lena had no one to call. The specific loneliness of a life built entirely from necessity and very little else. If the exhale had been something different, she stopped that thought. She wasn't ready to follow it yet. Outside, the dark landscape continued. Somewhere ahead of them, a farmhouse outside Vienna was waiting with a woman named Yoon Hye-rin, who had spent 4 years inside Mu-rion's network and had recently decided that the cost of staying was higher than the cost of crossing, and who was sitting at a kitchen table with cold coffee, and the expression of someone who had been on the wrong side of something long enough to know exactly which way was wrong. And somewhere above them, on a flight from Seoul, Kang Tae-jin sat with his hands flat on his knees and his eyes open, and the folded ultrasound photograph in his jacket pocket, the one he had carried for 14 months, and told himself that this time he would not be too late. He had no way of knowing yet whether that was true. He had no way of knowing that by the time he landed, Lena and Mara would already be at the farmhouse, and Mu-rion would already be moving through the city, like a man who had been patient for 5 years and had finally identified something solid enough to close his hand around, and that the last clear road back was closing behind all of them like a door swinging shut in a wind that had no intention of stopping. The point at which any of them could have turned back had already passed. It had passed on a rainy morning in Busan, in a corner office, when a man exhaled and a woman walked out, and neither of them said the thing that would have changed everything. What remained now was only forward. And forward, in the hours approaching dawn over Central Europe, was about to ask something of all of them that none of them had fully prepared for. The farmhouse outside Vienna smelled like cold wood and old stone, and the particular stillness of a building that had been sitting empty long enough to develop its own specific silence. Yoon Hye-rin had arrived 3 hours before Lena and Mara, which was exactly how she had planned it. She was 31 years old, and she moved through spaces the way people moved when they had spent years in environments, where being slow meant being caught efficiently, without wasted motion, checking angles before committing to crossing them. She had gone through every room first. Exits. Sight lines. The barn that was visible from the kitchen window, and the tree line beyond it, and the single dirt road that approached from the east. Then she had made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and waited. She had worked for Mu-rion's European logistics network for 4 years. She had stopped believing in the work somewhere, in the third year, quietly. The way belief usually died, not in a single decisive moment, but in the accumulation of small things that the mind kept filing away until the drawer wouldn't close anymore. The drawer had stopped closing the night she watched Mu Rion threaten a dockworker's family in Hamburg. Not with physical violence. Mu Rion rarely used physical violence. As a first instrument, he was too precise for that, too aware that fear, properly administered, was more efficient than pain. He had simply described in patient and specific detail what would happen if the dock worker failed him again. The wife, the two children. The children had been in the next room. The walls were thin. The youngest one had started crying, a small, confused sound, and Hei-rin had been standing close enough to hear it clearly. She had driven back to her apartment that night and sat at the kitchen table until 4 in the morning. After that, it was just a matter of waiting for the right person and the right moment. Seong-ho had been the right person. His name was known throughout Mu Rion's network, Kang Tae-jin's strategist. 30 years in, the man who had built the operational architecture that Mu Rion had spent a decade trying to dismantle. She had constructed a contact channel that took 6 weeks to build without triggering the network's internal monitoring, and Seong-ho had listened to what she offered without visible surprise, which told her he had been waiting for exactly this kind of asset for longer than he would admit. 3 months of documentation before he trusted her with the assignment. Protect a woman and a child. Get them to the farmhouse. Wait, she could do that. She heard the car on the approach road at 6:30 in the morning when the sky outside was the specific gray that preceded real light. One vehicle, moving at the pace of someone who knew the address and wasn't performing caution about it. She was at the window before the engine sound fully resolved. The car stopped. Doors opened. A woman got out first, lean, watchful, with the compressed alertness of someone for whom vigilance had become indistinguishable from breathing. A child next, small and precise, with eyes that caught the thin morning light in a way that made Hei-rin look twice, and then look away because looking twice felt like an intrusion. Then a large reddish-brown dog, who descended from the vehicle with the deliberate dignity of a very old animal who had decided that whatever was happening, he would participate in it at his own pace and not be rushed about it. Lena Mercer looked at the farmhouse. Then she found Hei-rin in the window. Their eyes met through the glass. Hei-rin raised one hand. Lena nodded once. Just once. The nod of a woman who had been reading strangers for 5 years and had made a rapid and specific assessment. Then she picked up her bag and walked to the door. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee and bread that Hei-rin had brought, and Hei-rin told Lena what was immediately relevant. 2 surveillance teams, the secondary one losing the train in Vienna, the contact inside Austrian Rail Administration, whose cooperation had bought Mu Rion's people a passenger manifest, but not the information that the ticket had been used by someone else while Lena and Mara exited at an intermediate stop. He knows the ticket was used and the physical description didn't match, Hei-rin said. He knows you're not in Vienna. He'll widen the search. How wide? He has resources and he has anger, Hei-rin said. Angry men with resources search wide. We have approximately 36 hours before this location becomes a probability on his map. Lena looked at the table. From the next room came Mara's voice, low, ongoing, the particular running commentary of a 5-year-old investigating new furnitures and reporting findings to Copper, who received all such reports with the same patient silence. Song-ho told me there was someone inside Tae-jin's organization, Lena said. Han So-yeon, Hei-rin said. Lena looked up. Hei-rin folded her hands around her cup. I've known her name for 8 months. She's been one of Mu Rion's most effective assets without ever formally joining his network. She doesn't operate like an informant. She operates like someone who decided whose side she was on before anyone knew there were sides. Does Tae-jin know? Song-ho told him last night. That's why he's on a plane. Lena absorbed this. She thought about So-yen. She had met the woman 4 times during the marriage, at organizational dinners, and 1 formal reception. Impeccably professional, impeccably presented, completely unreadable in the way of people who had decided that being readable was a tactical disadvantage. Lena had not liked her. had not been able to identify a specific reason not to like her, which had been the problem. No visible fault line, no obvious agenda, just the smooth, frictionless surface of someone presenting exactly what they chose to present. She had mentioned this to Tae-jin once. He had said So Yeon was one of his most effective people. He had not said trustworthy. He had said effective, and Lena had noticed the specific word choice at the time and filed it in the part of her mind that held things she couldn't do anything about yet. 3 years, Lena said. At minimum, Hayrens said. The documentation I've seen covers 3 years of regular information sharing. The initial contact may have been earlier. 3 years of Tae-jin's search being actively engineered to fail. 3 years of him getting close and finding nothing. 3 years of a woman standing behind him and calling it competence while she held the strings. Lena stood and walked to the window. The fields outside were going from gray to pale gold as the sun came up. Flat agricultural land, the kind that made no particular promises and kept the ones it made. There was something honest about it. He's not going to Prague, Hayrin said. Sung-ho gave him this location. Lena turned from the window. Something moved across her face that Hayrin couldn't fully categorize from where she was sitting. Not fear, not anger. Something more layered than either of those. Something that required more context than Hayrin currently had. Didn't ask me, Lena said. He didn't ask me whether I wanted him to know where we were. Her voice was even. It was the specific evenness of someone who had felt this particular thing before and had learned to carry it without letting it show in her face. Some made that decision. Again, someone deciding what's best for me without consulting me about what I want. She pressed one hand flat against the window frame. That's the mechanism. That's the whole mechanism that built this situation. Men deciding what's safest without asking what I want. Hayrin was quiet for a moment. The alternative, she said carefully, was you and Mara facing Murion's network with 36 hours and a farmhouse. I know that, Lena said. I know it. She took a breath. Doesn't change what it feels like. She dropped her hand from the frame. How long until he gets here? 3 hours. Maybe 4. He landed 2 hours ago. Lena straightened her posture in the particular way she had developed, not performance, not pride, the practical adjustment of a woman who had learned that how you held your body affected what your mind believed was possible. Then we use the time, she said. Tell me everything you have on Murion's operation. Not just what's relevant right now. Everything. Hayrin looked at her for a moment. All right, she said, and reached for the folder she had brought. Murion received the call at 7:40 in the morning, Vienna time. He was in a hotel suite, and he was eating breakfast with the methodical focus of a man who believed that maintaining normal routines in uncertain conditions was a form of discipline. And his contact's voice came through the phone with the flat, careful delivery of someone bearing disappointing news they had already rehearsed twice. The woman and the child had not appeared at Vienna Hauptbahnhof when the train arrived. They had covered every exit. A passenger named Jennifer Park had boarded in Prague. The ticket had been scanned. The woman who walked off that train did not match the physical description in their operational file. Murion set down his fork. She switched, he said, between Prague and at an intermediate stop. She put someone else on the train with the ticket. She's not in Vienna. He picked up his fork again. Set it down again. The small, precise gesture of a man redirecting frustration into stillness. Work faster. He ended the call and sat with his hands on the table, and his breakfast going cold in front of him, and thought about what kind of woman spent 5 years learning to move like this. He had studied Lena Mercer extensively in the past year. What he had expected to find was someone who had survived through luck, and Seong-ho's assistance, a frightened woman improvising, one step from breaking, sustained by adrenaline and the absence of a better option. What the surveillance reports had shown him instead was something that bothered him in a way he did not fully acknowledge, a woman who had gotten measurably better at this over 5 years. Not maintaining competence, improving, systematically, with the specific trajectory of someone who was treating survival as a skill set and working at it. She had made one mistake in Prague. She had stayed too long, allowed routine to develop. A human error. but she had identified his surveillance within 2 days of it being established, which was faster than most trained professionals managed. She had then executed a departure that required her to be multiple steps ahead of a team that was actively watching her. With a 5-year-old child and an elderly dog, Mu Rion had a category of trait he reserved for people who performed consistently above their apparent capacity. He did not enjoy adding Lena Mercer to it. He picked up a different phone. The farmhouses, he said. All properties within 90 minutes of Vienna that have any connection to Song Ho's network. Third-degree connections. Historical associations going back 20 years. Start immediately. Tae-jin arrived at the farmhouse at 9:17. He came alone. Hae-rin had her hand near her jacket when his car appeared on the approach road, because alone was not what she had been told to expect. And in her experience, the gap between what you were told to expect and what actually arrived was where most of the serious problems lived. But the car matched Seong Ho's description, and the man who stepped out of it moved with the particular economy of someone who understood that unnecessary motion communicated things you might not intend to communicate. He was not what she had built from 4 years of hearing his name. She had constructed Kang Tae-jin from the accumulated impression of Muryan's network, a man discussed with the specific mixture of professional resentment and concentrations that powerful rivals generated. Someone whose authority was treated as a kind of weather system, something you planned around rather than confronted directly. She had expected the performance of imposition, the physical presence that announced itself before the person did. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been awake for 30 hours on a long flight and had spent the hours. He wasn't sleeping in conversation with things that did not resolve into rest. Stood outside the car and read the farmhouse, the way professionals read spaces' exits, angles, the position of the vehicles, the question of the barn. Then the farmhouse door opened. Lena stood in it. Hae-rin positioned herself in the kitchen doorway, close enough to observe the entrance without appearing to supervise it, and she watched what happened between them with the careful attention of someone cataloging information for later use. 12 feet of distance. Neither of them moved toward the other. It lasted long enough that Hae-rin found herself holding more breath than was comfortable. Tae-jin's face did something complicated. The face of a man whose control was intact, but only because he had spent the last several hours reinforcing it specifically for this moment, aware of exactly how much it was going to need to hold. Lena's face was more opaque. She was looking at him with something that required more context than Hae-rin had to decode quickly. "You're alone," Lena said. "Yes, Song-ho wanted to come. I told him not to." A pause. "I didn't want it to feel like an operation." Something shifted in Lena's expression. Not softer. More focused. The shift of someone who has just received a piece of information that is more specific than they expected. "Come inside," she said. "We don't have much time." He followed her in. He stopped just inside the door when he saw Copper, who had risen from his position near the radiator to conduct the investigation that old dogs conducted with new presences, slow, thorough nose-led, without particular alarm or welcome, simply information gathering. Tae-jin looked at the dog. Then he looked at the doorway to the next room. Mara appeared in it. She was small and precise and fully awake, and she looked at Tae-jin with her father's eyes and the evaluative focus of a 5-year-old who had been taught, by 5 years of life in uncertain circumstances, that new adults in unfamiliar situations required thorough assessment before any other response. Neither of them spoke. Then Mara said, "You have the same eyes as me." Tae-jin crouched down until they were level. "Yes," he said. One syllable, doing an enormous amount of structural work behind it. Hae-rin moved quietly back into the kitchen, because what happened next was not something she needed to witness. 20 minutes later, they were at the kitchen table, Tae-jin, Lena, and Hae-rin with Mara drawing in the next room, and Copper asleep near the radiator, and Hae-rin spread her documentation across the table between them. Tae-jin looked at it without touching it first, reading the architecture before the details. Hae-rin recognized the approach and waited for him to finish it. "His European network," she said. "Safe houses, personnel, financial routing, communication channels, primary and secondary, 4 years of operational data, accumulated without triggering internal monitoring. She paused. I can transmit it simultaneously to law enforcement contacts in 6 jurisdictions. Interpol is one of them. His entire European operation dissolves in 24 hours. Tae-jin looked at her. Why, he said. Because I watched him threaten children, she said. And I got tired of knowing that and not doing anything about it. He held her gaze for a moment, the specific gaze of a man, calibrating the distance between what someone said and what they meant. Then he looked at Lena. You trust her. More than most people I've known longer, Lena said. Something close to acknowledgement moved across his face. All right, he said. Tell me what you're proposing. Hae-rin told him. The transmission required timing. If Murion had any warning, he would burn the network himself and rebuild it underground. It had to happen when he was exposed, in circumstances where authorities could move on the documentation and on him simultaneously, with no window for him to execute a controlled demolition of the evidence. You need to draw him out, Lena said, looking at Tae-jin. Or draw him to me, he said. You're going to use yourself as bait. Yes, no, she said. Lena, I said no. Her voice was not loud. The firmness of someone who had been in this specific argument before, in a different form, and knew exactly where the road led. You don't get to sit in this kitchen and build a plan you're going to execute without me. That's exactly how we got here. You made a decision. You didn't consult me. You signed those papers and exhaled like a problem was solved. She set her hands flat on the table. You don't get to do that again. The room was very quiet. Tae-jin looked at her. I'm not trying. What were you trying to do? She said when you signed those papers. His jaw moved. Protect you, he said, without asking if I wanted that kind of protection. You would have argued. Yes, I would have argued. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to, and maybe you would have been right, and maybe I would have been right, and maybe we would have found something in the middle that neither of us could have gotten to alone. But you didn't give us that chance. She looked at him directly. I am not your problem to solve. I am not your liability. I am not the thing you failed to secure. I am the person who spent 5 years keeping our daughter safe while you were looking for us. So when you build a plan in this kitchen, you build it with me. The silence afterward was different in quality from the silence before it. Tae-jin looked at the table. When he looked up, something in his face had changed. The control was still there, but what it was controlling had shifted. Tell me what you think we need, he said. It was not performance. It was actual listening, which is a different thing, and Hae-rin, who had been watching this exchange with the attention she applied to people under pressure, recognized the difference immediately. They talked for 40 minutes. The plan that emerged was not his and not hers. It was the plan that came out of the argument, and the correction, and the moments where one of them said something the other hadn't considered. Lena and Mara would go with Hae-rin to a location. Only Hae-rin knew a private eye address belonging to someone outside any professional network. Tae-jin would remain at the farmhouse. Murion would find it. He was good enough that he would find it. And when he arrived, the documentation would already be transmitting. Then Hae-rin mentioned Choi Jun-suk. She mentioned him carefully, the way you mention volatile things with precision, without drama, making sure the relevant facts were present before the assessment. 24 years old. Logistics coordinator in Murion's European network for 2 years. Recruited not through standard criminal pathways, but through a family debt situation that Murion had deliberately engineered and then offered to resolve the specific predatory patience of a man who grew his workforce by creating the conditions that made people feel they had no other option. Jun-sik had been efficient and reliable and had been quietly miserable about it for approximately 18 months. He had contacted Hae-rin 6 weeks ago. He wants out, she said. What does he want to do about it? Tae-jin said. He's positioned to coordinate the advance convoy Murion will send ahead of himself. He can create enough delay and confusion in that convoy to give us the timing window we need. Can we trust him? Lena said. He's scared, Hae-rin said. Scared people are unpredictable. Or extremely motivated, Lena said. Tae-jin looked at Hae-rin. Get him on the phone. The call lasted 11 minutes. Jun-suk had a young man's voice, with an older man's exhaustion living in it, and he answered Tae-jin's questions directly, which was either honest or very well prepared, and in either case the answers were specific and consistent enough to be credible. If you delay the convoy, Tae-jin said, "What's your exit?" "Car position 2 kilometers from the staging point," Jun-suk said. "Austrian plates, I drive northwest. I have an address." "How long have you been planning this?" A pause. "Since March." 5 months, Tae-jin said. "You've been sitting on this for 5 months." "I needed to be sure." Another pause. "You understand needing to be sure before you move?" Tae-jin was quiet. "Yes," he said. When the call ended, Hae-rin looked at him. "He'll hold," she said. "If he doesn't," Tae-jin said, "then none of the rest of it matters." He said it without self-pity. The straightforward assessment of a man looking at a structural load-bearing point in a plan and acknowledging what happened to the plan if it failed. Lena heard it from across the table and understood that he meant it. Literally, if Jun-sik broke under pressure, the convoy arrived intact, and Murayon walked into the farmhouse with 11 men and no external constraint. She had agreed to this plan. She had helped build this plan. She sat with what she had agreed to for a moment. "Tae-jin," she said. He looked at her. She wanted to say several things. She wanted to say that she had spent 5 years carrying a version of that exhale as her primary evidence about who he was, and that understanding it differently did not fix anything but change the shape of what needed to be fixed. She wanted to say that she was not the woman who had walked out of that Busan office. That woman was still in her somewhere. But 5 years had put a great deal of material on top of her, and she wasn't entirely sure yet what remained. She said, "Don't die in this farmhouse." He held her gaze. "I'll do my best," he said, "not a promise." He had never made promises he wasn't certain he could keep, and she had always, even in the worst years, respected that about him. She stood. They had 30 minutes before Hae-rin needed to move. She went to the next room where Mara was sitting with Kapur and her drawing, and she crouched beside them. "We're going on another small trip," she said. Mara rolled up her drawing. "Is the man with my eyes staying here?" she said. "For a little while." "Why?" "Because there are some things that need to be finished," Lena said. "And he's going to help finish them." Mara looked at the kitchen doorway. "He looks tired," she said. "He's been looking for us for a long time," Lena said. Mara considered this with the gravity she gave to significant information. Then she said quietly, "We should have left a note." Lena looked at her daughter's face, the gray eyes, the precise brow, the composed expression of a child who had spent her entire conscious life learning to absorb difficult things without breaking. "We should have," Lena said, "but we're here now." Murion's people found the farmhouse at 2 in the afternoon. Not through any elegant intelligence work, through the brute efficiency of having enough people covering enough ground that the probability of missing it became very small. Contact in the local land registry cross-referenced with a list of properties connected to names in Seong-ho's known network, and one address produced a match on a third-degree connection. A property registered to a company whose legal counsel had once worked for a firm Seong-ho had used 22 years ago. 3 degrees, more than 2 decades old. But Murion had people who looked specifically for this kind of residue. People who understood that the most durable connections were the ones nobody thought to hide because they predated the need for hiding. He received the confirmation at 2:12. He assembled his team with the patient efficiency of a man who had been outmaneuvered repeatedly in this particular situation and had concluded that patience was the correct response to repeated frustration. He did not hurry. Hurrying produced and mistakes in the final stage of something this long in development were not recoverable. He did not know about Jun-suk's arrangement. He did not know about the servers Hae-rin had positioned across 3 independent networks, calibrated to transmit simultaneously on a predetermined trigger. What he knew was this: Kang Tae-jin was in that farmhouse. The situation was, for the first time in 5 years, contained. He put on his coat. He told his 11 men to move. And in the farmhouse kitchen, Tae-jin sat alone with Hae-rin, who had refused to leave before the transmission was confirmed. with the specific stubbornness of someone who understood that the servers needed a human hand on them until the last possible, and a pot of cold moment, and a pot of cold coffee, and the particular silence of two people who have committed to something and are now waiting for it to arrive. The servers began transmitting at 2:47. Murion's convoy hit the delay Jun Ji-suk had arranged at 3:04. Murion arrived at the farmhouse at 3:31, 11 men behind him, moving with the compressed fury of a man who had waited for 5 years and had spent the last 27 sitting in a vehicle behind a problem that should not have existed. He pushed open the farmhouse door. He expected Lena. He expected Mara. He expected Tae-jin in the specific posture of a cornered man, the posture that said transaction, that said, what do you want and how do we end this? What he found instead was Tae-jin standing in the middle of the kitchen with no weapon visible and an expression that communicated neither desperation nor defeat, and behind him, a laptop displaying a transmission progress bar, reading 89% complete. Murion looked at the laptop. He looked at Tae-jin. You stayed, he said, the voice of a man whose assumptions have just been invalidated at the worst possible moment. You've been here this whole time, not running, not moving her somewhere. His eyes went back to the bar. 91% you stayed. Yes, Tae-jin said. While she ran. She didn't run, Tae-jin said. She finished what needed finishing. Then she left. Murion pulled out his phone. The call to his network's financial controller lasted 4 seconds. The controller told him the European accounts were already frozen, pending law enforcement review. The German authorities had issued a warrant 30 minutes ago. The Belgian office had been contacted. The Austrian federal police were. Murion ended the call. The bar read 94%. He stood very still. You gave them everything, he said. Not me, Tae-jin said. Someone who watched you threaten the wrong people one too many times. Something moved behind Murion's eyes, not fear, not yet, but the thing that preceded fear in very controlled people. The rapid internal recalculation that happened when the scenario you had been operating inside no longer matched the scenario you were actually in. 96%. He looked at his 11 men. He looked at the laptop. He looked at Tae-jin. And then Jong Murion, who had spent 15 years building a European network on the principle that patience and precision were sufficient to overcome any opposition, abandoned strategy. He nodded once. The kitchen became violent. It happened faster than it should have. 11 men in a space that size with a single table as the only terrain feature. And Tae-jin was not 11 men, and the math of that was immediate and unambiguous. He took the first 2 in the same motion, used the table as a pivot and then as a weapon, got his breath back against the counter, and was still managing the geometry of it, when a third came in at an angle he hadn't covered and connected with his shoulder, with something heavy enough to make the joint communicate very, very clearly that it was no longer fully cooperative. He stayed standing. Hae-rin held her position with her back against the server equipment, which meant her back was against the one thing in the room that absolutely could not be interrupted before completion. And she was not a trained fighter, but she understood space, and she used it with the specific usefulness of someone who had spent 4 years in environments where quick spatial thinking occasionally made the difference between a bad situation and a catastrophic one. 99%. Tae-jin had blood in his mouth from a collision he didn't precisely remember, and his shoulder was sending information to his brain that he was choosing not to process yet. And across the kitchen, Murion had produced a pistol and was holding it with the careful calm of a man who had decided to simplify the situation. Murion reached into his jacket with his free hand. He produced a small device, a transmitter, clip-on broadcast to secure feed. He clipped it to his lapel with the deliberate precision of a performance being established. There are people watching this right now, he said. His voice had found a different register, still controlled, but performing now, aware of the audience. 15 years of building an empire, reduced to this because of a woman. He raised the pistol. Kneel. Tae-jin did not kneel. Murion moved the gun slightly. Kneel, he said. Let them see it. Let everyone watching understand what your choices cost you. Tae-jin looked at the transmitter on Murion's lapel. He thought about the people watching, the network contacts across 12 countries, the men who calculated power by what they observed rather than what they were told. He thought about what kneeling in front of this man's camera would mean to every one of them. He thought about Mara. Mara in a car somewhere northwest of here, copper's weight against her feet, asking the question she always asked in cars: precise, sequential. The investigative instinct of a child who had grown up understanding that information was the only reliable protection. He looked directly at the transmitter. And then Kang Tae-jin, who had spent 15 years building an identity around never yielding to anyone, who had constructed an entire philosophy of self around the principle that the only things worth holding were the things you could hold standing up, went to one knee. Not in collapse, not in fear, deliberately. With the specific quality of a man who has made a choice and is making it visible, which is a categorically different thing from being forced. And anyone watching the feed who knew how to read, people would have seen the difference immediately. Murion blinked. The calculation in that blink was visible across the room. He had expected resistance. He had built the moment around overcoming resistance the performance required an opponent who performed opposition. He had not planned for choice. For her, Tae-jin said, quietly, just the transmitter in the room, not for you. For my daughter. Myeon raised the gun. The farmhouse door opened. Choi Jun-suk stood in it. He was breathing hard, his coat dirty from the field, his hands shaking with the full-body tremor of someone who has been holding a great deal still for a very long time and has just been allowed to stop. But his eyes were clear, and his voice, when it came, was steady. Don't, he said. Mu Rayon turned the pistol toward him. The transmitter on his lapel broadcast the moment to every contact on the feed, the moment when a man who had spent years building an empire of fear turned a gun on a 24-year-old logistics coordinator who had walked through the right door at the right time. The laptop bar completed, 100%. Across 6 jurisdictions, law enforcement servers received the complete documentation of 4 years of Murion's European operation, time-stamped, authenticated, and entirely sufficient. Outside the farmhouse on the approach road, sirens began. Tae-jin heard them from his knee. He had calculated the timing. He had built the plan around the timing. But hearing the sirens arrive was different from knowing they would arrive. The same way that understanding something is true is different from experiencing it as true, and the distance between those two things was something only the moment itself could close. He stayed on one knee until the sound fully resolved into something undeniable. Then he stood up. His shoulder was catastrophically wrong. His mouth was full of blood. 3 of the men who had come through the kitchen were on the floor for different reasons. The laptop screen displayed a transmission confirmation in 4 languages. The transmitter on Murion's lapel was still broadcasting. And Murion still had the gun pointed at Jun-suk, who was still standing in the doorway with his hands at his sides, and his breathing audible, not panicked, not ragged, but conscious and deliberate. The breathing of someone who had decided that breathing deliberately was the one thing they could control right now, and they were going to control it completely. Tae-jin looked at Jun-suk. He looked at the gun. He understood, with the clarity of someone who had spent 15 years reading people under pressure, that Jun-suk did not yet know whether he was capable of what the next 30 seconds might require, and that not knowing was the most dangerous condition a person could occupy in a room with a loaded weapon pointed at them. You don't have to do anything, Tae-jin said. His voice carried across the kitchen with the weight of someone who had learned to make people hear him without raising his volume. You only have to stay. Jun-suk's hand steadied by half. Outside, the sirens had reached the dirt road. The farmhouse door was still open behind Jun-suk, and the cold Austrian afternoon was coming through it, and the gun was still up. And Murion's eyes were running the last available calculation. The calculation of a man who has watched his empire dissolve in real time, and is arriving at the conclusion that the numbers will not recover no matter how many times he runs them. And the gun did not move toward the floor, and it did not fire, and the sirens turned onto the property road, and somewhere northwest of the farmhouse, Lena Mercer sat in a car she hadn't chosen, and did not yet know whether the farmhouse had held, and the cold Austrian afternoon waited with complete indifference for whatever came next. The gun did not fire. Not immediately. Murion held it, aimed at Jun-sik, for 3 seconds that occupied a different quality of time than the seconds before them, the kind of time that expanded under pressure, where every detail became unnecessarily precise, where Tae-jin could see the specific tension in Murion's trigger finger, and the way the barrel moved fractionally with each of the man's controlled breaths, and the particular angle of afternoon light coming through the open door that fell across Jun-suk's coat and made the dirt on it visible in a way that hadn't been visible before. 3 seconds. Then Murion turned the gun toward Tae-jin. The shift happened without announcement. One moment the gun was on Jun-suk, the next it was on Tae-jin, and the calculation behind that shift was visible if you knew how to read it. Jun-sik was not the audience. Jun-suk was not the point. Jun-sik was a young man who had walked through a door and could be dealt with afterward. Tae-jin was the point. Tae-jin standing up from his knee with blood in his mouth and a shoulder that was communicating structural failure with increasing urgency. That was what the transmitter's audience needed to see. What Murion needed them to see. The image that would outlast everything else the feed had broadcast in the last 6 minutes. "You knew I'd come here," Murion said. His voice had changed. The performance layer was still there, but something had worn through it from underneath the rawer thing. The thing that 15 years of cultivated control had been laid over but had not replaced. The whole time. "You were never going to Prague. You stayed here and you waited for me." "Yes," Tae-jin said. "You knew I'd find it." "Yes." "And you stayed anyway, yes." Murion's grip on the gun tightened slightly. Not enough to be called preparation. Enough to be called pressure. "Why?" Tae-jin looked at him. The blood in his mouth had the specific flat taste of something that had been building for a while, and his shoulder was past the point of sending useful information and had entered the territory of simply broadcasting a sustained signal that he was choosing to route around. He stood with his weight on both feet, because letting the shoulder affect his postures would have communicated something he didn't want to communicate. "Because you were going to find the farmhouse regardless," he said. "And I needed you here, not looking somewhere else. For the documentation. For the documentation. For the jurisdictions. For the timing." He looked at the laptop on the counter behind him, without turning his head, just the slight shift of attention that acknowledged it. "All of that needed you in a specific place at a specific time. You cooperated." Murion's jaw moved. It was a small movement. The kind of small movement that in a less controlled man would have been something louder. "You used yourself." "Yes, knowing I'd have 11 men. Knowing you'd have 11 men. And your shoulder." Murion's eyes moved to it briefly. "Professionally. The assessment of a man who understood bodies under stress and what they could and couldn't do. That happened in the first 2 minutes." "Yes. And you kept going." Tae-jin said nothing. Murion looked at him for a moment with something that was not quite respect, and not quite its opposite, something in between. The complicated regard of a man confronting a version of commitment he had spent his entire career categorizing as weakness, and was now being required to reassess in real time. "For them," Murion said. "Not a question. Confirming something. For a woman and a child. Yes." He stopped. Outside, the sirens had reached the property. Tires on gravel. Doors. Voices in German, the clipped, coordinating efficiency of people who had received actionable intelligence, and were acting on it with the specific organized urgency that distinguished professional law enforcement from everything else. Murion heard it. His 11 men heard it. 3 of the men on the kitchen floor began making the calculations that men in their position made when they understood that their employer's situation had become critically distinct from their own, that whatever happened to Murion in the next several minutes, their own calculus was separable, was personal, was a question of how fast they could reach an exit before the exits were managed. One of them stood up. He was the one with the best remaining mobility, which meant he had taken less damage in the first 30 seconds than the others, which meant he had also held back slightly in the initial engagement, which was the kind of information that was interesting but not immediately actionable. Tae-jin moved before the man had his feet fully under him. Not toward Murion. Laterally. using the kitchen table as a pivot point, putting himself between the standing man and Jun-suk in the doorway, because Jun-suk in the doorway was a vulnerability that had been present since the moment he walked through it and had not been resolved by the arrival of sirens outside, did not immediately change the physics of a man with restored mobility in a kitchen. The man swung. Tae-jin took it across the already compromised shoulder and felt the joint do something that removed it from the category of problems he could defer and placed it in the category of problems that were actively happening right now. The specific sensation was not pain in the ordinary sense it was. Beyond the threshold where pain was the right word, into the territory where the body stopped reporting sensation and started reporting structural events, like the difference between a crack in a wall and a wall that was no longer a wall. He overrode it. He drove the man backward with everything he had in his legs, which was still considerable, because the legs had not been the problem. And the refrigerator received the impact of both of them and moved 6 inches across the tile floor with a sound that was enormous in the enclosed space. The man slid down the front of it and stayed down. Tae-jin's right arm was now completely non-functional, not painful, beyond painful, present the way a missing step was present as an absence where something load-bearing used to be, maintained now by habit and necessity and nothing structural. He kept it moving because stopping it meant acknowledging what stopping meant, and he was not in a position to make that acknowledgement yet. Mu-ryeon still had the gun. He had not fired during the refrigerator exchange, and Tae-jin understood why without having to think about it. The transmitter on his lapel was still broadcasting, and whatever remained of Mu-ryeon's operational instinct understood that shooting Tae-jin on a live feed to his own network contacts, in a farmhouse with law enforcement on the property, was not a recoverable position. The image it would produce would not be the image Mu-ryeon needed those contacts to hold. But the gun was still up, and at the door, 3 officers, moving in the organized way of people who had received exterior communication that had updated their approach, not carrying visible weapons, because the initial entry protocol for this type of situation required minimizing the visual provocation during the first contact moment, and this decision was producing visible tension on all 3 faces as they assessed the kitchen they had just entered. Jun-suk had moved from the center of the doorway during the refrigerator exchange. He was against the wall to the right of the entrance now, which was the tactically correct position, and which told Tae-jin that Jun-suk either had training he hadn't mentioned or instincts that had been sharpened by 2 years of working in environments where reading rooms quickly was a survival skill. Hae-rin was still behind the laptop. She had blood on her lip from a collision Tae-jin hadn't seen happen, and she was watching Mu-ryeon with the expression of someone who had moved past fear into something more functional, the specific alert stillness of a person who had identified the one thing in the room that could not be interrupted and had made themselves into its protection. The transmission bar read 100%. It had read 100% for 90 seconds. Hae-rin had not moved from her position. Mu-ryeon, Tae-jin said. The man looked at him. The gun did not move. 12 officers outside. They have the documentation. Account numbers, personnel files, safe house coordinates, 4 years of communication logs. Tae-jin's voice was even. His shoulder was a sustained event he was not engaging with. The transmitter on your jacket has been broadcasting your face and your voice for 8 minutes to every significant contact in your network. They have watched you lose. He held Mu-ryeon's gaze without effort, the way you held gazes when what you were saying was simply true. Put the gun down. Mu-ryeon's face did something extraordinary. It cracked, not dramatically, not the visible collapse of a man overwhelmed by emotion. The crack of very controlled things, when the force maintaining the control is removed sudden, complete, with a finality that made the preceding control seem, in retrospect, like a temporary condition rather than a permanent one. He was looking at Tae-jin, and he was also looking at something interior, some accounting that was running numbers and returning the same result no matter how many times he ran it. He lowered the gun 6 inches, then raised it again. The side door came in. The utility corridor on the east side of the building, the secondary entry point that Tae-jin had noted when he arrived at 9:17 that morning and had included in the operational picture he had given to Song-ho during the flight, which Song Ja-ho had passed to the relevant contacts, which had been in the briefing documents that the Austrian federal officers had read 40 minutes ago. 2 officers came through it fast and low, and the kitchen became a different kind of violence, the organized, procedural kind, with voices giving commands in German that required no translation because commands in any language had a grammar that crossed the language barrier. Murion turned toward the side door. He turned away from Tae-jin. 1 second. Less than 1 second probably, though it occupied more than that in the experience of it. Tae-jin crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and hit Murion from behind. The gun went one direction. The transmitter went another. The 2 of them hit the kitchen counter and then the floor, and it was not elegant and it was not controlled, and Tae-jin's shoulder had now exceeded every threshold it had and was somewhere beyond the territory he had language for. But he stayed on top of Murion and kept him there, until an officer's hand came down on each of them with the impersonal, practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before and would do it again. The gun was on the floor. The transmitter had stopped broadcasting when it hit the tile. Officers were in every room. Murion was face down with his wrists being secured, and he was saying something in Korean that Tae-jin didn't catch because of the noise and the blood in his ear that he hadn't noticed until now. Tae-jin sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet under the sink, his legs straight in front of him and his right arm doing nothing, because asking it to do anything was not currently an option he had access to. Hae-rin appeared beside him. She crouched and looked at his shoulder, with the specific expression of someone assessing damage they already know is significant and are now determining how significant. Hospital, she said. Later. Tae-jin, later. He looked around the kitchen. Jun-suk was still against the wall. He had not moved during the entry. He was shaking now, the full-body tremor of someone who had been holding something very still for a very long time and had been given permission to stop holding it. And what happened when that permission arrived was not graceful, but it was honest. "You're all right," Tae-jin said across the room. Jun-suk looked at him. "You're all right," Tae-jin said again. Not a question. The specific register of someone saying a true thing to someone who needs to hear it said rather than simply understood. Jun-suk nodded once. Then he slid down the wall and sat on the floor, and an Austrian officer came over and crouched beside him and spoke in careful, simplified German. And Jun-suk's answered in the approximate German of someone functional in it and grateful right now for any language that wasn't the one he normally operated in. Tae-jin closed his eyes for 10 seconds. In those 10 seconds, he took inventory. Shoulder, structural failure, likely significant. 3 or 4 ribs on the left side were communicating opinions about the last 40 minutes with increasing insistence. The blood in his mouth was from his lip. The cut above his eye had sealed itself. He had been in worse physical condition. He was fairly certain. He opened his eyes. An officer was standing in front of him, with the expression of someone who was professional about what they did and deeply skeptical of the specific situation they were currently doing it in. "Kang Tae-jin," the officer said, "yes. You will come with us." "I understand." He began the process of standing, which required ignoring a significant amount of physical information his body was generating. "One phone call first." The officer looked at him. "One call," Tae-jin said. "Then I will answer every question you have for as long as you need." The phone rang twice. Lena answered on the second ring, which told him she had been holding it. "It's over," he said. The silence on her end lasted 4 seconds. Murion. In custody, network exposed, documentation transmitted completely. Another silence. Shorter. "Are you hurt?" He considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "Yes, how badly?" "Hospital required, not life required." She made a sound that was not quite a word. Something between a breath and a response, the sound of someone receiving information they had been braced for but were still processing. "Hae-rin is fine," he said. "Jun-suk is fine. I'm about to spend several hours explaining things I would prefer not to explain. Tae-jin, are you and Mara all right?" "Yes. Mara is asleep in the back seat." Copper is taking up the floor. Good. His voice was doing something. He wasn't fully in control of some roughness in it that came from places he wasn't going to identify while sitting on a kitchen floor surrounded by Austrian federal officers. Nyla. When this she said, not harshly. The way you said, don't to someone when you knew what they were about to do and knew it was the wrong moment. Not on the phone. Not right now. All right, he said. Where are they taking you? He looked at the officer standing above him. The officer told him. He told Lena. I'll come in the morning, she said. With Mara. He understood everything contained in that sentence. The conditional. The specific choice of morning rather than tonight, which was not logistical, but was about the architecture of what came next. The choice to not collapse the distance immediately, to let the night do its work, to arrive when things had settled into something more navigable than the immediate aftermath of a kitchen that still had blood on the tile and a refrigerator 6 inches from its original position. The inclusion of Mara, which was both practical and something more than practical. Thank you, he said. She hung up. The officer was still waiting with professional patience. Tae-jin put the phone in his pocket and followed the officer out of the kitchen and through the farmhouse and into the cold Austrian afternoon, past the evidence technician photographing the laptop, past the transmitter on the floor, past the space where 3 men were being processed against the wall with their hands behind them. He walked through the farmhouse door. The fields were the same pale gold they had been that morning when Lena arrived. The light had shifted to the lower angle of late afternoon, the kind that made everything look slightly more significant than it was, which was either a mercy or an inconvenient depending on what you needed from the moment. Mu Rayon was already in a vehicle 40 meters away. Tae-jin did not look at him. He looked at the fields, and the tree line, and the dirt road, and then he got into the vehicle that was waiting for him, and answered the first question they asked, and then the second. And the questions continued for several hours, and he answered all of them because he had decided on the flight from Seoul that transparency was the only available path. That the architecture of the old life was already dismantling itself. It's nothing, and there was nothing to gain from defending the ruins. The processing lasted until 11 at night. Hae-rin was in a separate room going through her own version of it, which moved faster because her documentation was complete and pre-organized, and because she had been preparing for this specific conversation for 6 weeks. She had brought everything in order, which was the kind of preparation that communicated to investigators that the person across the table understood the difference between cooperation and performance, and that this was the former. Jun-suk was in a third room with a lawyer who had arrived 40 minutes after the initial entry arranged by Seong-ho from Seoul before Tae-jin's plane had even landed, which meant Seong-ho had anticipated this outcome and prepared for it was confirmed, which was entirely consistent with 30 years of watching how Seong-ho operated. The officers were professional. They were also skeptical, which was appropriate in the scope of what they were being presented. But the documentation was unimpeachable. 4 years of Hae-rin's careful, methodical accumulation, structured and cross-referenced and authenticated at multiple points, and skepticism, in the presence of sufficient documentation, eventually became something that resembled reluctant comprehension. Tae-jin's shoulder was examined by a medic at approximately 8 in the evening. The medic used the expression that medical professionals used when medical professionals themselves, when they were preventing, had been commenting on how long a person had been operating with an injury that required immediate intervention. Imaging, the medic said. I know. Likely surgical. I know. You've been functioning with this for 4 hours. Is there something you can do that helps in the next 12? The medic did what could be done. Immobilization. Something for the pain that Tae-jin accepted with the specific gratitude of someone who has been declining to notice the full extent of what they're in and has now been given permission to stop declining. The pain medication did not make things better. It made the pain approximately 30% less insistent, which was sufficient to allow more linear thinking, which was what he needed. He signed documents until there were no more documents. An officer told him he was free to go, but should remain in Austria, pending further interviews. He said he intended to. Seong-ho called at 11:40. So Yin, Tae-jin said, before Seong-ho could speak. Her access was frozen this morning, as you authorized. She left the building at approximately 10:15. A pause. We don't know where she went. She'll surface, Tae-jin said. She always does. Her financial exposure is fully documented. The authorities will find her. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Song-ho, yes. The organization. He meant the criminal architecture 15 years of construction, the last several years being quietly hollowed out by distraction and betrayal, and the accumulated cost of searching for something while someone inside dismantled the search from below. Begin the process. Which process? The one we discussed on the plane. He shifted his immobilized arm and felt the movement make an argument he declined to engage with. Close it. The parts that need closing. The legitimate operations survive. Everything else, Tae-jin. That's 15 years. I know what it is, he said. I know what it costs. Do it anyway. Song-ho was quiet. He said finally, and come to Vienna, Tae-jin said. Not now. In a few days. When the initial process here is further along. Why Vienna? Tae-jin looked out the window. The parking structure of the holding facility, lit by the flat white of overhead lighting, entirely without interest. Because that's where we're going to be, he said. Lena and Mara. That's where she's been building something. He paused. I don't know what comes next, but whatever it is starts in Vienna. Seong-ho was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, there was something in his voice that Tae-jin had heard only a small number of times in 3 decades, a particular warmth that Seong-ho normally stored very deep and produced only in circumstances that genuinely warranted it. I'll be there Thursday, Seong-ho said. Thank you, Tae-jin said. He ended the call and sat in the emptied room until an officer came to tell him. A vehicle was available to take him to the hospital, and he went, and the imaging confirmed what the medic had suspected, and a surgeon explained what would be required and sat back and waited for the answer. Can it wait until tomorrow afternoon? Tae-jin said. The surgeon looked at the imaging again, looked at him, looked at the imaging again. Tomorrow afternoon, she said. Not later, not later. Not later, he agreed. He checked into the hospital room they gave him and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark with the immobilized arm and the pain medication doing its approximate work, and he sat there with the specific exhaustion of a man who had spent 5 years in pursuit of something and had arrived at it to find that arrival was not an ending but a beginning, and the beginning was going to require things that pursuit had not required. But pursuit required only persistence. What came next required him to need something badly enough to say so. He had spent 15 years building an identity around never needing anything from anyone. He lay down without taking his jacket off, because that operation was beyond his current capacity, and he stared at the hospital room ceiling, and at some point the exhaustion and the medication together overrode everything else, and he slept. Lena arrived at the hospital at 8:43 in the morning. She came with Mara, who had buttoned her coat wrong, because she had done it herself and had communicated with complete clarity that assistance in this area was neither requested nor welcome. She came with Copper, who was technically not permitted in a hospital, and whose presence Lena had arranged through the specific combination of professional confidence and selective eye contact that she had developed over 5 years of doing things in institutions that were not strictly sanctioned. The nurse at the 3rd floor desk looked at Copper. Lena looked at the nurse. The nurse looked at the chart in front of her. Room 318, the nurse said. Thank you, Lena said. The door to 318 was half open. She stopped in the hallway and looked through the gap before entering the old habit, the one that had been so thoroughly trained into her that it operated below conscious thought now, the reflexive assessment of any space before committing to it. What she saw was Tae-jin sitting up in the hospital bed with his arm immobilized and his clothes from yesterday, and his face carrying the specific quality of someone who had slept badly in a position they hadn't chosen. And he was looking at the window, and he looked like a man who had spent a very long night in conversation with things that didn't resolve easily. She pushed the door open. He turned. She watched him register Mara beside her and recalibrate the specific visible adjustment of a person who is trying very hard not to perform, and is therefore slightly more visible than usual in the effort of not performing. He adjusted his posture. He adjusted his face. He arrived at something that was not what he had been wearing when he turned, and was not entirely what he was trying to present somewhere in between, which was the most honest place he had occupied in years. Mara looked at his arm. "What happened to it?" she said. "I hurt it yesterday," he said. "Does it hurt now?" "Some. Mom knows how to fix things," Mara said. The complete, unqualified confidence of a child who had spent her entire life watching her mother fix things and had drawn the reasonable conclusion that this was simply what her mother did. She fixed Copper's leg when he hurt it. Tae-jin looked at Copper, who was investigating the corner near the radiator with the professional thoroughness he applied to all new radiators, assessing it against the accumulated standard of every radiator he had encountered in 5 years of moving through Central Europe. "Is that right?" Tae-jin said. "She fixes lots of things," Mara said. She came further into the room and assessed the hospital bed with the evaluative eye she gave to furniture. "Can I sit on that?" Lena said. "It's fine," Tae-jin said. He shifted to make room, managing the immobilized arm with practiced economy. "Come up." Mara climbed up with the efficiency of a child who had learned to be economical with her body in small apartments and sat beside him and looked at the window. "There's nothing out there," she said. "Parking structure," he said. "That's boring." "Yes." Lena stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the two of them sitting there, Mara matter of fact. Tae-jin handling the specific novelty of a 5-year-old's proximity with the careful attention of a man trying very hard not to do anything wrong, and something moved through her that she had been holding at a distance for 24 hours. Because there had been no safe place to put it down. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was something earlier than either of those, the recognition that the person in front of you is real and present and not the version of them you've been carrying in your head, and that the real present version required a different response than the carried version had. She pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down. "Mara," she said, "go see if there's a water machine in the hallway." Mara looked at her. "I'm not thirsty. That's okay," Lena said. "Go find out anyway." Mara considered this with the negotiating instincts she appeared to have been born with rather than developed. Then she climbed down from the bed with efficient resignation and went into the hallway, and Copper, demonstrating his characteristic solidarity with Mara's movements, followed her. Lena looked at Tae-jin. Tae-jin looked at Lena. "She's extraordinary," he said. "Yes, I know what she looks like," Lena said. Not cutting. The acknowledgement of something she had been looking at for 5 years and did not need explained to her. "I know." A silence. Not uncomfortable. The kind that existed between people who had finally said enough things that they could afford to not say things for a moment without the silence becoming its own problem. "The shoulder," she said. "Surgery this afternoon." "Are you scared?" He looked at her. The directness of the question surprised him, not the content, but the fact that she asked what she actually wanted to know rather than what she was supposed to ask. "No," he said then, a little. "That's honest." "I'm trying to be honest," he said. "More than I used to be." She looked at her hands. "The exhale," she said. He did not pretend not to know what she meant. "Tell me," she said, "what it actually was." He was quiet for 4 seconds. "Relief," he said. It was relief. But not. He stopped. Tried again. "I had been trying to solve the problem for 6 weeks. The problem of keeping you safe. I had built the logic of it. The divorce removes you from the formal equation, removes you as a target with legal standing relative to my organizations. And when you signed him," she said. "I believed I had finally done the right thing," he said. "Not the easy thing. What I believed was actually right." And the relief was jaw moved. The relief of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a long time and believes they have finally set it down properly. Lena looked at him. "You set me down," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly what I did, and I told myself it was an act of protection." His voice did not waver. He had decided to say this without the usual controls in place, and he was doing it. It was an act of control that I dressed in the language of protection. Because I could not tolerate the alternative, which was admitting that I did not know how to keep you safe, and that not knowing frightened me more than anything else I had ever encountered in my life. The room was very quiet. You were afraid, she said. Yes. And instead of telling me you were afraid, I made a unilateral decision. Yes. The door opened and Mara came back in with a cup of water she had obtained from a machine she had located through investigative determination and the assistance of a nurse who had apparently found her impossible to refuse. And she walked directly to Tae-jin and held the cup out to him. I wasn't thirsty either, she said. But you might be. He looked at the cup. He looked at his daughter's face, the gray eyes that carried something structural he recognized, and the way you recognize things that were part of you before you knew they were. The dark skin and the composed precision of a child who had spent 5 years in circumstances that required composure and had developed it as something natural rather than performed. He took the cup. Thank you, he said. Mara climbed back up on the bed with the efficiency of someone returning to a preferred position, and Copper settled near the radiator. And Lena sat in the chair and looked at her family in a hospital room in Vienna with a boring parking structure outside the window. And she thought about Prague and the cramped apartment and the 3 a.m. nights and the fake names and the bakery she had stopped going to. And she thought about the sound of sirens on a dirt road outside a farmhouse. Over, which was not the same as finished. Over was a line. Finished was what happened after you crossed the line and looked back. They were at the line, and Mara was sitting next to her father in a hospital bed, telling him with complete authority that there was nothing interesting outside that window. And he was agreeing with her, and it was the most ordinary exchange Lena had witnessed in 5 years, and she held on to it. Not as resolution, as a beginning. Surgery at 2, she said. Yes, we'll be here when you come out. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise of anything larger. It was a statement about the afternoon, and he received it as exactly what it was. And he did not try to make it more than what it was, because he was learning slowly, imperfectly, that the thing she needed from him was not decisions. It was this. Just this, all right, he said. Mara leaned against his good shoulder. She didn't ask. She just leaned. And Kang Tae-jin, who had spent 15 years being untouchable and had discovered that untouchable was another word for unreachable, sat very still and let his daughter lean against him and did not move, and breathed carefully around the pain in his shoulder and the considerably larger thing in his chest that had no clinical name but was present and specific and not going anywhere. Outside the door, the hospital continued its ordinary business, and the morning held. And neither of them knew yet what the afternoon would ask, or the week after, or the year that followed, but the morning was holding, and they were in it, and for now that was exactly enough. The surgery lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Lena knew this because she counted. Not obsessively, she had things to do while she waited, practical things, the kind of logistics that didn't pause, because the emotional situation had become large. She needed to arrange accommodation that wasn't a back seat and a farmhouse contact. She needed to call the Prague clinic and explain her absence in terms that were honest enough to be credible and limited enough to be safe. She needed to feed Copper, who had been patient about the hospital situation with the dignity of a very old dog who had decided that human logistics were complicated, and that patience was the correct response to complexity. She did all of these things. And she counted, 2 hours and 40 minutes. The surgeon came out at 4:17 and told her the procedure had gone as well as they could have hoped, and that Tae-jin was in recovery and would be moved to his room within the hour. She used the word we repaired, we addressed, we found in the way surgeons did when they wanted to distribute credit across the team. And Lena, who had spent enough years in medical environments to understand the grammar, appreciated both the honesty and the professional generosity of it. Can I ask something? Lena said. The surgeon waited. How long had he been operating with it before he came in? A pause. Based on the imaging and the degree of tissue response at minimum 4 hours. Possibly closer to 6, he didn't stop. No, the surgeon said. He did not. Lena nodded once. She went back to the waiting room where Mara was drawing on the back of a hospital pamphlet with a pen she had acquired through methods. Lena had not tracked and chose not to investigate. And Copper was asleep under the chair, with his muzzle on his paws and his breathing the slow, meditative rhythm of a very old dog who had determined that sleep was his contribution to the current situation and intended to contribute it fully. Is he okay? Mara said without looking up. He's okay, Lena said. What did they do? Lena sat down and explained in the simplified but accurate terms she had always used with Mara, not talking down, not obscuring, just calibrated to what was immediately relevant and what could be left for later. Mara listened with her pen still moving across the pamphlet because she processed information best when her hands were occupied, which was something Lena had noticed when she was 2 and which had never stopped being true. Like when you fixed Copper's tendon, Mara said. Similar principle, Lena said. Mara nodded and went back to drawing. Lena sat beside her in the waiting room and looked at the institutional ceiling and thought about what the surgeon had said. 4 hours, possibly 6. He had taken 11 men in a kitchen with one functional arm and a shoulder that had been wrong since the first 2 minutes, and he had stayed on his feet. And he had stayed because the plan required him to be there. And the plan required him to be there because that was where the weight needed to be held, and he had held it. She sat with that for a long time. She did not decide anything from it. She was not ready to decide anything from it, but she sat with it. Han So-yin was found in Luxembourg on a Thursday. Not by law enforcement, they located her 3 days later. When the documentation trail that Hyren had built pointed them to a specific property, registered to a holding company, registered to another holding company, to a name that eventually connected to a woman who had spent 3 years practicing the art of connection through intermediaries. The trail was long, but it was complete, and completeness was what mattered. Song-ho found her first. He had spent 40 years developing the specific skill of knowing where people went when they believed they were disappearing. And he understood So-yeon well enough to know that her version of disappearing would involve a particular quality of comfort, not extravagance, not the kind of obvious luxury that attention, but the specific, refined comfort of someone who had always believed they deserved better than their circumstances had provided, and was now finally providing it for themselves. He did not tell Tae-jin he was going. He went, confirmed what he needed to confirm, spoke briefly with certain people, and came back. He told Tae-jin the result by phone from the airport. She's there, he said. The authorities will have her by the weekend. The financial documentation is, there is no version of this where she doesn't answer for what she did. Tae-jin was in the hospital room, 2 days post-surgery. The color had come back to his face, and the restlessness that came from being still when his mind was not still had begun to make itself visible in the way he held himself against the bed. It's the slight forward lean of someone whose body had decided it was finished with recovery, even though the timeline had not. Speak with her, he said. Briefly, Song-ho said. She knew I was there before I found her. She's very good. What did she say? A pause. The pause of a man deciding how to relay something accurately without editorializing it into something different. She said she made the only calculation available to her, given what she understood about the organization and her position in it. And she said she doesn't regret it. Tae-jin looked at the window. The parking structure. He had spent more time looking at that parking structure than any piece of architecture deserved. Do you believe her? He said. Yes, Song-ho said. I think that's the most honest thing she said in 3 years. Why? Because regret requires believing you had a better option, Song-ho said. So Yin built her entire professional identity on the premise that attachment was a liability and leverage was the only reliable currency. She looked at you and Lena, and she saw leverage and distraction. She wasn't wrong about what she saw. She was wrong about what it meant. A pause. But she doesn't know that yet. That's the kind of thing you learn slowly. She'll have time. They ended the call. Tae-jin sat with the window and the parking structure and the particular silence of a hospital room in the afternoon, and he thought about So-yin's calculation. The coldness of it, the patience of it. 3 years of sustained performance. 3 years of standing behind him and maintaining the precise face of loyalty, while holding the strings that kept him searching and failing and searching again. He tried to find in himself the anger he expected. He found something more complicated. He found underneath the betrayal and the 3 years and the specific cruelty of what she had done to Mara's access to him without any of them knowing, a kind of exhausted comprehension. So Yan had learned the organization, the way the organization taught people. Leverage, containment, the management of human beings as resources. She had learned it from the environment he had built. She had applied those lessons to him with the precision of an excellent student. He could not entirely separate himself from the environment that had produced her. He sat with that for a long time. It was not comfortable. He sat with it anyway. Song-ho arrived in Vienna on Thursday, as he had said he would. He came to the hospital first. This was not efficient, and Seong-ho was an efficient man. He would normally check in, review materials, establish the operational picture before making personal calls. Coming to the hospital first was something else. He sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at Tae-jin with the expression he reserved for the small number of situations in 30 years where something real had happened, not professionally real, not operationally significant, but the other kind of real, the kind that required a different face than the one he kept ready. "You look terrible," Song-ho said. "I'm aware," Tae-jin said. The shoulder. 6 to 8 weeks for function. Full recovery possible with sufficient therapy. "Will you do the therapy?" "Yes." Song-ho looked at him. "You'll actually do it," he said. Not skepticism. Confirmation of something. "Yes," Tae-jin said. "I'm going to be here for a while." "I need the arm to work." Seong-ho nodded slowly. He looked around the hospital room with the methodical attention he gave to every new space exits, angles, the quality of the light, the organization of what was visible. Then he looked back. "She came yesterday," Tae-jin said. "I know. She called me this morning." Seong-ho paused. She had questions about the organizational transition, about what closing certain operations actually meant for the people working in the legitimate businesses, the ones who didn't know the full picture. He folded his hands. She was asking on their behalf. She wanted to know if they'd be protected. Tae-jin was quiet. "That's what she called you about," he said. "First thing," Song-ho said. "Yes." Tae-jin looked at the window. He thought about Lena's call. Yesterday she had brought Mara, and Mara had informed him with considerable authority that the parking structure had exactly 47 visible cars because she had counted, and he had found himself counting with her from the window, and it had been the most purely absorbing 12 minutes he had experienced in recent memory. After Mara had taken Copper to investigate the corridor, Lena had sat in the chair, and they had talked about the organizational transition. Not personally, practically. She had wanted to understand the timeline, the people affected, the legal exposure for the legitimate workers. She had not asked him why he was doing it. She knew why. She was asking how, which was the more useful question, and it was the question that required the most from him. "She's practical," Song-ho said, reading something in Tae-jin's expression. "She's always been practical," Tae-jin said. "I used to mistake it for simplicity." "It's the opposite of simplicity." Seong-ho nodded. He unfolded his hands and refolded them. A gesture Tae-jin had seen from him before when Sung-ho was about to say something he had been carrying for a while. "Tae-jin, I know," Tae-jin said. "You don't know what I'm going to say. You're going to tell me the transition is going to take longer than I've told myself. That there are people in the organization who won't accept it cleanly. That legal processes will outlast my patience. That rebuilding on legitimate foundations while the old structure is still partially standing is the most dangerous kind of construction." He looked at Seong-zo. "And then you're going to say that you'll help, that you've always helped, and that you need me to tell you what I actually want so you can build toward it instead of guessing." Seong-ho regarded him. "That was accurate," he said. "I've known you for 30 years, Tae-jin said. "What do you actually want?" Tae-jin looked at the parking structure. 47 cars. He and Mara had counted 47. "I want to be in the same city as my daughter," he said. "I want to stop being a reason she can't be safe. I want to learn who she is." He paused. "She's 5 years old, and I don't know her. I know she counts things. I know she's like her mother in ways that are going to make her life very interesting. I know she makes decisions about people quickly and trusts those decisions completely. I want time to find out what that becomes." He looked at Seong-ho. "That's what I want. I can build the rest around it." Sung-ho looked at him for a long moment. "That's enough," he said. I can build toward that. Copper died on a morning in January, 2 years after Vienna. He had been slowing for months, in the way that very old dogs slowed, less interested in new radiators, less invested in the investigative possibilities of each morning, content to remain in the warmth of whatever room the family occupied and breathe with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a creature winding down with full dignity intact. Lena had known it was coming. Knowing did not make it easier. She had told owners this 100 times across her career, and it had never stopped being true, which was either the most useful thing about the truth or the most exhausting, depending on the day. He went on a Tuesday morning. In the living room of the house they had found outside Vienna, a house with a garden, on a street quiet enough for Mara to walk to the corner without supervision, with enough room for the 2 rescue animals who had arrived in the months after the farmhouse and who were watching now from the doorway, with the careful distance that animals maintained around process they understood but could not help with. Lena sat on the floor beside him. Tae-jin came and sat beside her without being asked, which was the right thing to do, and which he had learned over 2 years to do, without calculating whether it was right first. Mara sat on Copper's other side and put her hand flat on his flank and did not say anything, which was unusual for Mara. But she understood. She had always understood things before she had the words for them. Copper's breathing slowed. Then it stopped. Gentle. Quiet. The most ordinary, devastating thing. Lena sat with her hand on his side for a while after. Tae-jin put his arm around her the repaired shoulder. Functional now. Reliable in the way of things that had been broken and correctly healed. And she leaned into it, and they sat on the living room floor with their daughter and the watching animals and the January light coming through the window, and nobody said anything for a long time. Eventually Mara said quietly he waited. What? Lena said. He waited until we stopped leaving, Mara said. He knew we weren't going anywhere anymore. So he stopped waiting too. Lena looked at her daughter's face. 7 years old. The gray eyes had deepened, not lighter with age, as some children's eyes went, but richer, more complex, the color of deep water in the specific way that suggested depth rather than surface. Yes, Lena said. I think that's right. They buried him in the garden. Tae-jin dug the hole himself. Working with the careful economy of a man who had learned, in the years since Vienna, that physical work was not beneath him and was in fact one of the few things that organized his thinking when his thinking needed organizing. His shoulder held. He dug until the depth was right, and then he stepped back and called Mara, who placed a drawing in the ground beside Copper, a drawing she had been working on for a week without telling anyone what it was, a drawing of the 4 of them in Copper, the family portrait she had been making in various versions, since the farmhouse morning when she had first looked up and said, "You have the same eyes as me." Lena said a few words, not formal words. Kind of words you said to a living thing that had stayed with you through the worst years of your life, that had slept against your legs in cheap motels and train compartments and a cramped Prague apartment, that had eaten the pieces of Mara's first birthday cake that fell on the floor and had been the only other breathing presence on the 3 in the morning nights, when breathing presences were what stood between Lena and the specific. Loneliness of people who had been running too long. Thank you, she said, for staying. The words were simple because simple was what she had, and simple was what was true. Mara was 17 when she found the box. She was not supposed to be going through the storage room, not forbidden. Exactly. But the storage room was the particular kind of space that accumulated things a family hadn't fully decided what to do with yet. And Mara, who at 17 had her mother's precision and her father's absolute refusal to leave things unexamined, had decided on a Saturday afternoon that the storage room needed to be organized, and she was going to be the one to organize it because nobody else was going to do it properly. Lena heard her moving things for about 40 minutes before the moving stopped. Then Mara called from the doorway, "Mom." Her voice had a quality in it that Lena recognized, the specific quality of a person who has found something that requires recalibration before they know how to respond to it. Lena came to the doorway. Mara was holding a cardboard box from the back of a shelf, behind Lena's veterinary school textbooks, and a box of Mara's early drawings that Lena had kept because she had found herself constitutionally unable to throw away evidence of what Mara had been at 5 and 6 and 7. "Whose is this?" Mara said. Lena looked at the box. She had not opened it. Tae-jin had brought it to Vienna in the second year and placed it on that shelf without comment, and she had understood without asking that it was his, and that he would address it when he was ready. And that ready might take time, and that time was something they finally had. "Ask your father," she said. Tae-jin was in the garden when Mara brought him the box. He was doing the thing he did on Saturday afternoons, when the weather permitted, tending the section of the garden that had become, without particular planning, a space for the rescue animals and the growing things that Mara had planted with the aggressive optimism of a teenager who had decided that aggressive optimism was the correct approach to gardening and had not yet been proven wrong. He looked at the box in Mara's hands. She looked at him. "Is this yours?" she said. "Yes. Can I know what's in it?" He set down the tool he was holding and took the box from her and carried it to the garden bench and sat down. Mara sat beside him with the patience she had when she understood that something required patience, a different patience than her ordinary waiting, more deliberate, more aware of itself. He opened the box. Inside, 3 notebooks of different sizes, filled with his handwriting in Korean and English that shifted depending on what he was trying to say. And beneath the notebooks, a small envelope. He picked up the envelope. He held it for a moment. Then he held it out to Mara. "Your mother's name is on it," he said, "but I think she should read it with you." Mara looked at the envelope. "What is it?" she said. "Something I wrote a long time ago," he said, "when I was still looking for you, when I was trying to understand what I had done wrong." "And did you," she said, "understand?" He looked at her. 17 years old, the gray eyes that had become entirely their own thing, carrying his structure but not his history. The composed directness of someone who had grown up in a household where honesty was treated as more respectful than comfort. Eventually, he said, "Not all at once." "What was it?" she said. "The thing you did wrong." He thought about this carefully, the way he thought about things that mattered enough to require care. "I believed that knowing what was best for someone was the same as loving them," he said. "I believed that protection and partnership were the same thing. When I chose protection over partnership, when I decided alone what was best for your mother, I didn't stop loving her. But I stopped treating her like someone whose voice in her own life was as important as my strategy for keeping her alive." He looked at the garden. "Those are not the same thing. It took me longer than it should have to learn the difference." Mara was quiet. "And now," she said. "Now I know the difference," he said. "Most days I manage to live by it. Most days," she said. "I'm not perfect," he said. "I've never been perfect. Your mother will confirm this." The corner of Mara's mouth moved. "She already has," she said, "multiple times. In detail. She's very thorough." He looked at her. Then he laughed. Not the managed expression that had been his public face for most of his adult life, the real thing, slightly rough, the laugh of someone caught genuinely off guard, which happened more often now than it used to, which he had come to understand was not a loss of control, but a gain of something more valuable. Mara watched it happen with the expression she had worn since she was 5 years old in a farmhouse doorway, cataloging something for later, filing it somewhere important. "She is," he agreed. Lena read the letter in the garden. It was October, and the light had the specific amber quality of autumn. In Central Europe, warm and slightly distant, the kind that made everything look like it was being seen through old glass. The kind that made you aware of the seeing as much as the thing being seen. Mara was inside doing something Lena hadn't tracked. Tae-jin was beside her on the bench, close enough that she could feel the presence of him, but not touching, giving her the reading as her own thing which he had learned, across the years, was how she needed certain things, and which he now gave without being asked, which was its own kind of evidence. The letter was 8 pages. His handwriting was smaller than usual, compressed the handwriting of someone trying to say a great deal in the space available. Not because they were cramped, but because they had been thinking about it for a long time, and there was genuinely a great deal to say. He had written it 14 months after she disappeared. He had been in Tokyo, in a hotel, after a lead that had gone cold, the way all the leads went cold. and he had ordered room service he didn't eat, and sat at the desk, and written 8 pages that he had never sent because he didn't know where to send them, and had carried instead folded in the inside pocket of whichever jacket he was wearing for the 14 months that followed. He told her about the cities: Tokyo, Berlin, Prague the first time 3 months before she settled there, close and not close at all, the specific cruelty of proximity without knowledge. Budapest, Lisbon, the hotel rooms that blurred into each other until what he remembered was not rooms but the quality of the silence in them. He told her about the night in Frankfurt when he understood what she had meant about the exhale. He had been in a room for 3 days, and not a single person on earth had known whether he was well or unwell, or simply whether he continued to exist. And the specific quality of that anonymity, the absence of anyone who would have noticed either way, had made him understand something about himself that the Empire had obscured for 15 years. It felt like being alone, he wrote, not the ordinary aloneness of a man who spent evenings without company. The other kind. I had built a fortress and sealed myself inside it and called the ceiling strength. And what I discovered in Frankfurt on a Wednesday night was that the fortress was also a cell, and had been for a very long time. And the only person who had ever made me aware of being inside it was you, because you were the only person I had ever allowed close enough to the walls to see them from the outside. He told her about the ultrasound photograph. He told her that he had carried it in his jacket pocket for 14 months after Xiongho gave it to him, and that he had taken it out in those hotel rooms and looked at it not with hope. Hope had become dangerous. By then, a resource he could not afford to spend on things that hadn't materialized, but with a kind of factual accounting of what he had done. He told her about the engraving. He had chosen it on the day he bought the rings, a phrase from a conversation they had once had on a pier in Busan in the early months when she had said something about the nature of love that he had not been able to stop thinking about afterward. He had asked for that specific engraving because he had been aware, even then, even when the future felt long and uncomplicated, that his world was not a world that guaranteed continuity, and he had wanted her to have something that acknowledged that love was not a function of presence, that it didn't require the same room to remain true. He had not known how hard those words would be tested. He had not known how far the meeting again would have to travel before it arrived. He closed the letter with a few lines that had none of the controlled architecture of the pages before them, larger handwriting, less even, as though the control had worn through over 8 pages of saying true things. Whatever you have decided about us, I hope you have let yourself be something other than careful sometimes. I hope Mara has seen you be something other than strong. I hope there has been someone, a friend, a neighbor, a dog who gave you the ordinary thing, the boring, mundane, ordinary thing that I should have understood from the beginning was the whole point. I am going to keep looking, not because I believe I deserve to find you, but because the alternative is stopping, and I am not ready to stop. Lena sat with the letter in her hands for a long time after she finished reading. The garden was doing its ordinary October thing. The apple tree was mostly bare. The animals had gone inside an hour ago with the infallible timing of creatures that understood weather better than people did. The amber light was going blue at the edges, the afternoon shifting toward evening the way it always shifted gradually, and then completely. She turned the envelope over. The ring was inside. Mara had mentioned it before she came out in the brief, precise summary that Mara gave of things when she understood the information was necessary without yet understanding the full weight of it. Lena tipped the ring into her palm. It was exactly as she remembered it. White gold, simple, the band worn slightly at the edges from the years she had worn it. The engraving inside, she read it, "Until we meet again," closed her fingers around it. Beside her, Tae-jin was still giving her the silence. He was looking at the apple tree with the expression he used when his thoughts had taken him somewhere and he was allowing her whatever the moment needed without filling it. "Tae-jin," she said. He turned. She held up the ring. He looked at it. He looked at her. "The exhale," she said. "I know what it was now. I've known for a while." She paused. "I just needed to hear you say it." "I know," he said. "It took me a long time to ask." "I know that too." She looked at the ring in her palm. "I'm not putting this back on right now," she said. I want you to know that's not a statement about where we are. It's a statement about the fact that some things need more time than other things, and I've spent enough of my life making decisions faster than was good for me. Yes, he said. But I'm keeping it, she said. That's also a statement. He held her gaze. I understand the difference, he said. She closed her fingers around the ring and put her hand in her pocket and felt the specific weight of it. They're not heavy, actually lighter than she remembered, but present in the way that small significant things were present, communicating something through the palm without requiring words. From inside the house came Mara's voice, calling something about dinner and whether anyone had bought bread, and Tae-jin called back that he had bought bread yesterday and it was in the second cupboard. And Mara said that was not where the bread went, and Tae-jin said it was where he had put it, and Mara said that those were not the same thing. And Lena sat on the garden bench and listened to this exchange, and felt something in her chest that had been wound very tight, for a very long time ease by a fraction. Not release, ease. A fraction. It was enough. She stood and picked up the letter and the envelope and carried them inside, into the warmth of the kitchen, where Mara was standing at the counter with the architectural certainty of someone who had decided where everything belonged and was in the process of returning the bread to its correct location. And Tae-jin was watching this with the expression he reserved for moments when being corrected by his daughter was the finest thing happening in the room. And the two rescue animals were positioned at the strategic boundary of the cooking area with the patient optimism that animals brought to kitchens where food was being prepared. Lena set the letter on the table. She looked at her family. No guards at the door, no packed bag on the closet floor. She did not check the exits. She pulled out a chair and sat down. The bread goes in the third cupboard, she said. Your father has been putting it in the second cupboard for 2 years, and I have been moving it. Mara turned and stared at her. You knew, I always know, Lena said. Tae-jin looked at her. Always, he said. She said. I choose which things to address. He absorbed this. What else, he said. What else have you been choosing not to address? She looked at him across the kitchen table. In the October evening in the house outside Vienna, in the ordinary complicated life they had been slowly, imperfectly building in the years since a farmhouse held long enough for it to become possible. You want a list, she said. No, he said. Smart, she said. Mara made a sound that was approximately laughter and put the bread in the third cupboard and began taking things out for dinner with the efficient purposefulness of someone who had been running her mother's kitchen since she was old enough to be. Trusted with sharp objects, which in Mara's case had been earlier than was strictly advisable and had been non-negotiable anyway. Tae-jin got up to help. Lena watched him, his shoulder moving correctly now, healed into function, the specific way he had learned to occupy this kitchen over 2 years of being in it. No longer the careful guest behavior of the first months, but something more settled, more habitual, the way a space looked when a person had stopped performing being in it and was simply there. He looked up and caught her watching. She did not look away. What, he said. Nothing, she said. I'm just looking. He looked back at what he was doing. She kept looking. Outside, the garden was dark now. The apple tree was a shape against the darker sky. Somewhere beyond the fence, the street did its ordinary evening business neighbors. A car, the occasional voice that drifted and disappeared. No sirens, no surveillance on the corner, no false names. Lena put her hand in her pocket and felt the ring there, in the pocket of the ordinary sweater she wore, in the ordinary kitchen of the ordinary house she had chosen, in the ordinary city, where she had built a practice now in its 3rd year with 3 veterinarians and a waiting list and a reputation for taking the cases that other practices found too complicated. The complicated cases had always been her specialty. They had always been. She took her hand out of her pocket. She did not check the exits. She got up and went to help with dinner, and the kitchen held the 3 of them and the sounds of cooking and Mara telling Tae-jin with considerable specificity why he had been cutting the onions incorrectly for 2 years, and Tae-jin listening with the full attention of a man who had learned that listening was not the same as yielding, and that the difference mattered, and Lena stood beside them and listened too, and it was domestic and ordinary and imperfect and entirely enough. She was home. She had been for a while now. She was just done pretending otherwise. and in her pocket, the ring waited. Not a resolution. Not a conclusion. Not the ending of a thing, but the beginning of a different kind of middle, the kind that didn't require emergency, didn't require flight, didn't require anything more than showing up in the same kitchen on an ordinary October evening and being present for it. The ring waited. She would know when. And when she did, there would be no ceremony about it. No performance. She would simply take it out and put it on. And Tae-jin would see it and say nothing. And the nothing he said would contain everything. And Mara would notice eventually with the eyes that noticed everything, and would say something precise and true about it. And that would be the whole of the moment. Simple. The whole point had always been simple. She had just needed long enough to find her way back to it.